Chapter 1143 Reasonable Development. I can only maintain it for about a minute or so. That's way too short, isn't it? A thought flashed through Klein's mind. Without thinking about anything else, he took 2 steps to the desk. He put down Grosel's travels and quickly wrote on a piece of paper with 0-08, George III plans to use this speech to bait out all his enemies who want to sabotage his ritual. However, if everything goes smoothly and nothing happens, he'll take the opportunity to consume the potion and reveal his trump card to aim for divinity. After all, there are too many unknowns in the future, making it unsafe. Furthermore, he has made appropriate preparations for the ritual. They're already prepared to an adequate level. This is a very reasonable development. After Klein wrote the last sentence, and before he could check if there was anything wrong with the written content, the dim quill in his hand disappeared without a trace, as though it had never existed. And those few words seemed to drain all of his energy, making him feel dizzy. He took a few steps back and collapsed into his chair. It doesn't make sense. It wasn't exhausting for Zangwill back then. It should be because I forcefully summoned it, and I didn't dare let 0-08 weave a story on its own. When I wrote on the piece of paper, I had to rely on my own spirituality to support it. As for Zangwill, he could get 0-08's cooperation, so it wasn't that draining. Klein closed his eyes and used cogitation for a while before feeling better. Under normal circumstances, having had no physical contact with 0-08 and merely meeting it once had made it impossible for him to summon this Grade 0 sealed artifact. However, on the one hand, he had the Snake of Fate to personally augment his luck, and on the other hand, he had Grosel's travels. This was the item left behind by the Dragon of Imagination Ankwelt. Inside it was the City of Miracles, Liveseed. It had a connection to a certain degree to an existence like 0-08. If it wasn't for some high-level existence's disruption, these 2 items would have long been reunited. Klein didn't know if this fate and particular connection could increase the chances of a successful summoning. He only wanted to give it a try since he didn't stand to lose anything. To his surprise, he really succeeded. And it was precisely because of this that he didn't dare to use Grosel's travels to bear the contents of 0-08's projection. He didn't even dare to let them come close, afraid that something irreversible would happen. This was Backlund, which had an extremely dense population. Yes, logically speaking, there shouldn't be any accidents. After all, 0-08 is a historical void projection. It's fake. Grosel's travels was conjured by the Dragon of Imagination, and it's also fake. A fake combination can't be real in any way. They lack the foundation of a Beyonder characteristic. I can go back to the uninhabited Reef Islands to test it. Klein rubbed his temples and returned to the desk. There, he began reading what he had just written. He didn't directly write that George III would be unsuccessful in his advancement and die on the spot. He believed that if he interfered with a sequence 1 angel, the projection of 0-08 wouldn't be able to be so direct. He had to be more tactful. Furthermore, there was also the psychology alchemists and Amon's brother. Overly obvious effects would definitely be detected and easily made use of. All he could do was beat about the bush to mitigate the unknown. I hope it works. After staring at it for a while, he folded the piece of paper and stuffed it into his pocket. Then, he sacrificed Grosel's travels back above the gray fog. After doing all of this, Klein began to consider another problem. It was when he would head out to buy some ice cream for Wuxia. Backlund has Zeradal, and it's very possible that Amon is there. If I head out too frequently, we might run into each other. It's a little dangerous. Why don't I summon some ice cream for Will from the historical void? It's very real when eating it, and it'll disappear in 15 minutes. There's no need to worry about gaining weight at all. It's just splendid. Klein couldn't help but mumble inwardly. In the end, he decided to change his clothes and leave the house because he had to keep his promise. Saturday morning, the sky was gray and misty. It made one feel inexplicably stifled. This was a common scene in Backlund's deep winter. Although the smog wasn't as thick and pungent like last year, the geographical environment and climate characteristics had determined that such situations would definitely exist for a long period of time. Furthermore, victory over environmental pollution was never something that could be declared in a year or two. After putting on a black coat that covered her knees, and a black veil hat, Melissa quickly walked to the door. Benson held his hat and shook his head. A young girl who isn't even 20 years old should be dressed like a teenager. You look overly mature and old-fashioned in that, understand? Old-fashioned. Melissa glanced at her brother and simply replied, "The price of a pound of bread has risen by a quarter pence." "This price," Benson said. He then took out a silver pocket watch covered in vine leaf patterns and snapped it open. "Let's go. There's still a long way to go to the municipal square." Melissa tersely responded and went out into the streets with her brother. "Good morning, Mrs. Daniel." After taking a few steps forward, Benson saw a neighbor leaving. He greeted her with a smile. He was good at chatting and had long established a good relationship with his neighbors. The lady named Mrs. Daniel wore a pure black dress. She was in her 40s and had a thin face. Her face was covered in a thin black veil that hung down from her hat. When she heard the greeting, she nodded and replied simply, "Good morning, the two of you." She didn't make any small talk, and she coldly walked away. As he watched her back, Benson deliberately slowed down his pace. When they finally opened up a distance, he turned to ask his sister, "What happened to Mrs. Daniel?" "I've been too busy recently, so I haven't visited the neighbors in a long time." Melissa pursed her lips and said, "Mrs. Daniel's eldest son was confirmed to have died on the front line at the Amantha mountain range." News from yesterday. That tall, bashful, but thoughtful, kind, and sincere young lad? When he came back the last time, he said that he was promoted in the army and became an officer, Benson asked in surprise. Melissa nodded. "I couldn't imagine that Larry would die just like that, just like how she couldn't imagine the tragic deaths of her classmates at school." In just a few seconds, some people could no longer speak, communicate, or study. Benson was silent for a moment before sighing. "I've been busy lately. Actually, I've been dealing with bereavement payments, but perhaps the list I received didn't include Larry, so I'm not sure. There's a lot of information on that list. Some are cheerful, others are humorous, others are the only child within a family. Some are determined, while others are the leaders of the soldiers around them. Some just got married and don't have children. Some are preparing presents for their youngest daughter, while others had love letters with them. They planned on sending it at the post office after the battle. But, they're all dead." Melissa and Benson fell silent at the same time, and neither of them spoke for a long time. When they were almost at the intersection, Melissa looked at the road ahead and said in a low voice, "What do you think His Majesty will be talking about in his speech today? Perhaps it's a form of musters, or perhaps it's to convey the faith that we will prevail," Benson said in passing. Melissa turned to look at her brother. "This isn't like you, Benson. Shouldn't you be making some snarky remarks? It should wait till the speech is heard and the specific content is understood. The most basic principle of being a person is to not make comment on things that one doesn't know enough of. Otherwise, they would be worse than a curly-haired baboon," Benson said with a smile. At this moment, he saw another neighbor. The other party's hair was white, and his face was half covered with a scarf. He was wearing a thick jacket and was holding a cloth bag in his hand as he hurried past the siblings. "Mr. Thomas's dressing is so strange. Does he still need to do something else?" Benson looked at the back of the man and asked in puzzlement. Melissa replied in a low voice, "Mrs. Thomas is sick, and that spent quite a bit of their family's savings. Recently, with food prices sharply increasing while Mr. Thomas's income remains the same, he has to queue up at the soup kitchen every few days to get some bread. He's a decent gentleman, so he probably doesn't want others to recognize him. Also, the food at the soup kitchen is always limited. If one's late, there might not be any left. They'll have to go to the cathedral, the workhouse, and other places." The handouts just happened to start after His Majesty's speech, so Mr. Thomas probably wants to go there directly. Benson nodded slowly and asked in concern, "What's wrong with Mrs. Thomas?" "I know a few good doctors." "A disease caused by anxiety," Melissa explained what she had heard. "Mrs. Thomas is very worried about her youngest child who's serving in the army." "You mean Thomas Jr.?" Benson frowned slightly. After receiving his sister's confirmation, he fell silent, as if recalling something. After a while, when they approached the nearest municipal square, Benson looked ahead and whispered, "Thomas Jr. is already dead." Melissa didn't respond, but her expression was a little dazed. They walked forward silently, as if they were relying on inertia. More and more people appeared in front of them. These people were either dressed in formal attire or holding canes, dressed up as gentlemen. Otherwise, they were dressed in blue, green, yellow, and red-colored skirts, sweaters and leather jackets matched with pants, or dark-colored petticoats. Their colors were dull. They came out of their houses and from the streets they were on, like water droplets splashing upward. They merged together at the intersection, forming a tiny stream. The stream surged ahead, combining with other tributaries, and flowed into the square's entrance, interweaving into a majestic torrent. The torrent slowly surged forward, flooding the square. Amidst this torrent of humans, Melissa felt like she was as puny as a water droplet. Chapter 1144. Narrowly due to the fact that they had arrived early, the seats that Melissa and Benson could choose from weren't too bad. They could directly see something strange on the grayish-white stone pillars in the middle of the square. Its two heads dramatically differed in size and were painted with dark blue paint. It was connected to some cables. At the foot of the object was a troop of soldiers in red shirts and white pants. They were carrying grayish-white metal backpacks, as well as complicated structures and small-caliber rifles. They were watching their surroundings in high alert. As more and more citizens gathered, the square began bustling with activity. At 9 o'clock sharp, the strange object on the stone pillar suddenly produced sizzling sounds. Finally, it changed into a deep and thick voice. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your emperor, ruler of Lone, East Balam, and Rorstad Archipelago, George Augustus III, that thing can talk. It's using the principles behind the telegram." Melissa's eyes widened as her attention shifted from the speech to the strange thing. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm your emperor, ruler of Lone, East Balam, and Rorstad Archipelago, George Augustus III." At Memorial Square in Westboro, Audrey accompanied her father, mother, and elder brother near the platform. She looked at the king in his formal attire as she attentively listened to his speech. As she knew in advance what George III would be focusing on today, and the mood that would be created, Audrey didn't wear anything that she was fond of. Be it the colors or style, they were nothing a girl would wear. It was the same as the Earl's wife, Caitlin. The dress was simple and conservative. It was black in color without any traces of accessories. "I'm very happy but also feel heavy-hearted to tell everyone that we've finally stopped the first stage of the Phaeacian attacks. We've foiled their plans of annihilating Lone within 3 months. But many outstanding young people have already died at the front lines and died in this war. They had a better future ahead of them. They should have accompanied their parents in growing up, aging together with their spouses, and allowing their children to grow up in a loving environment and have a good childhood. The Phaeacians have destroyed everything." Knowing why this war had started, Audrey wasn't incited by the king's speech. She only felt that he definitely had talent in inciting drama. She heard slight sobbing sounds coming from the crowd around her. She could feel the sadness rising bit by bit as they intertwined and brewed. Her eyes reddened uncontrollably. The king's speech was very fake, but the sorrow of the people was real. In particular, Audrey had seen many family members who had been killed, having helped those who had lost their children, husbands, and father overnight. This is a great resonance of emotions, the best place to consume the manipulator potion. Audrey suddenly came to a realization, but she was unable to make use of it because, not only had she not digested the Dreamwalker potion, but she had yet to provide enough contributions to Mr. World. She slowly took a deep breath and controlled her emotions. She shifted her gaze away from King George III and let her thoughts wander. Mr. World is very concerned about today's speech. I wonder how he's going to exploit this. I hope it won't lead to a serious accident. That thing called a radio broadcast is based on the principles of wireless radio transmission. Mr. World mentioned that certain factions at sea have already put such technology to use. Compared to the sea, which is constantly affected by storms, something like this is clearly more suitable for use on land. As the thoughts flashed through her mind, the stern and old-fashioned George III finished the first part of his speech and solemnly said, "Let us mourn for our heroes here. Ladies and gentlemen, recite this together with me in your hearts. In the name of Emperor George III, I wish for the dead heroes to be at peace. I hope they will become eternal in the kingdom of the deity they believe in." This sentence carried an indescribable sense of dignity, making everyone, including Audrey, involuntarily lower their heads, clasp their hands, and silently recite, "In the name of Emperor George III. In the name of Emperor George III. On the other side of Memorial Square, Klein, who was wearing a black coat and an ordinary face, stood and prayed with the crowd around him at the same time. He appeared completely normal. After 3 minutes of silence, he used an avian marionette standing on the roof of a nearby building to carefully observe George III's every move in an attempt to find a sign that the king was about to quietly leave and enter the mausoleum to consume the potion. According to Klein's understanding, the "In the name of Emperor George III" segment was core to the entire Black Emperor ritual. If one were to consume the potion, it would definitely happen at this moment, or within 2 to 3 minutes after the collective mourning. The effects would likely be lacking if there was any delay. George III is also silently mourning. He isn't doing anything else. Klein held back his impatience and puzzlement as he patiently waited. Tears streamed down many people's faces as the mourning gradually came to an end. Everyone opened their eyes one after another. At this moment, George III didn't do anything. He spoke again and continued his speech. "We've already endured through the most difficult part. We'll definitely defeat this evil and brutality. This is the power of justice. This is the power of every soldier at the front lines. This is the power of every factory worker, this." The arrangement by 0-08 wasn't successful. George III has no intention of becoming a god today. He's just trying to bait any enemies who want to destroy his ritual. In any case, he can still give many more speeches like this in the future. Klein frowned slightly as thoughts flashed through his mind. Suddenly, his expression turned solemn as he thought of a possibility. In the blink of an eye, Klein switched places with Anuni, who was hiding in the sewers. The latter was dressed the same as him, and his external appearance looked identical to him. Following that, Klein took 4 steps counterclockwise and went above the gray fog. With the help of the crimson star representing Miss Justice, he used his true vision to observe the situation in the square. He was already a sequence 3 beyonder, so there was no need for him to use the sea god scepter to widen his field of view. Of course, compared to a scholar of yore, a sea king's true vision was obviously much larger. However, there was no need for that. The moment his gaze landed on the stage where King George III was giving his speech, his gaze froze. There was no one there, or rather, there was only a fake phantom. It was an imagined George III giving the speech. Before the speech, Klein had been wary of this problem. He had specially observed and confirmed that it was the real George III. Who knew that, within a few minutes, the real George III would become an imaginary George III? In the midst of his silence, he had used the Black Emperor Pathway's powers to distort and silently swap himself with a substitute. George III should have already entered a secret mausoleum and is consuming a potion in an attempt to advance. With a thought, he quickly checked the surrounding area and discovered that there was something abnormal beneath the platform. Boundless black energy was secretly emanating from there. He then picked up the Black Emperor card on the surface of the long bronze table and tried sensing it. Using the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics, he confirmed that the power belonged to the Black Emperor pathway and came from the distortion powers. Impressive. While using a speech to bait the enemy, he disguised himself as a fake person and secretly left to consume the potion. There's not much time left. Klein's heart tightened as he immediately returned to the real world. In the sewers, he recited in Jotun, the sacred spirit that pursues knowledge, the mysterious world's lighthouse, eyes that pry into fate, the royalty above the sea, the pure and holy Bernadette Gustave. This was the honorific name of Queen Mystic, but it was somewhat different from a normal sequence 3's. Its range was very large and was effective all across Backland. With regards to this, Klein suspected that the eldest daughter of Emperor Roselle had used a Grade 0 sealed artifact to achieve this effect. Bernadette rarely told her honorific name to anyone, afraid that some enemies would use the prayer and automatic response property to lock onto her position before she reached sequence 2. This was very similar to what Klein had thought of. Klein had come to an agreement with her that, as long as he recited her honorific name, she would choose any secret mausoleum and open the door with the symbol drawn by the blood in an attempt to destroy it. Both of them didn't have any hopes of success, because the guards in the mausoleum would definitely chant the honorific names of the angels every once in a while, causing a situation that allows them to see the corresponding areas through the prayer point of light. Once they discovered something amiss, they would immediately rush over to help. Bernadette's main purpose was to attract attention. Of course, if those angels were to arrive at a slower pace, Queen Mystic could also go from providing support to being the main offensive force. After doing this, Klein immediately stretched out his right hand to grab the air. As his arm pulled back, a figure appeared in front of him. It was a woman with average facial features and dark eyes. She wore a simple robe and a tree bark belt. Her raven-black hair hung down as she stood bare feet without any shoes or socks. The Evernight Cloister's matron, the ascetic leader, the servant of concealment, the grounded angel, Ariana. I succeeded in one try. Klein was shocked, but he didn't think too much about it. He quickly said, "Keep my existence concealed and protect the people of Backland." He was worried that after George III lost control due to the destruction of his ritual, he would rush out of the mausoleum and harm the people of this city. "All right," Ariana replied with a calm expression. She wasn't rigid or stiff at all. "It can't be her, in person, right? Actually, my summoning wasn't successful, but the goddess had already gotten Ma'am Ariana to secretly return to Backland. The moment she sensed that she had been summoned, she came over. An angel of the concealment domain also has a certain degree of control over their historical void image." As a thought flashed through his mind, he realized that he had entered a special state, no longer being sensed by the outside world. Chapter 11:45 3 Arrows. At the same time, Klein didn't have the time to think about such trivial matters. After having his existence concealed, he immediately got Inuni to switch places with a new marionette who was formerly a pirate. Immediately following that, he activated Creeping Hunger and brought Inuni and Konas to the secret mausoleum in Awa County. As he could only maintain 3 images from the historical void at the same time, it was impossible for him to abandon his marionette and directly come over by using a summon projection. It would occupy a crucial spot. As for the remaining marionettes in Memorial Square, they wouldn't die on the spot in half an hour. They would only appear to be in a daze. However, this wasn't something that would attract too much attention while listening to a speech. Finally, if he didn't return, the Red Gloves team from the Church of Evernight would clean up his tracks. At the same time, outside the secret mausoleum in Eastchester County, there was a young lady in a yellow layered dress and a black, old-fashioned bonnet. Pea vines grew out of nowhere as they appeared. Her chestnut hair cascaded down naturally. Her eyebrows were long and straight, and her eyes appeared as though they were filled with a blue sea. Looking at the mountain wall in front of her, Queen Mystic extended her right hand and quickly formed a symbol in the void. Following the movement of her fingertips, drops of bright red blood that resembled shattered gems seeped out and froze in midair. Soon, a complicated symbol formed from layers of doors appeared. They trembled slightly and seemed to resonate with something somewhere else. In the blink of an eye, the blood-colored symbol extended into an illusory translucent door. Through it, one could vaguely see a gigantic mausoleum formed from black rocks. Bernadette immediately walked through the illusory door and arrived inside a dim and dark area. The light here came from the lights of stone pillars and strange underground moss growing on the cliff walls. Together, they illuminated the secret mausoleum in the light fog at the bottom. The symbol provided by Mr. Door was really useful. At this moment, as a ritual was being held deep underground, faint lights gathered, forming a figure midair in the darkness. The figure had a square face, black hair and blue eyes, a high nose bridge, and a thick beard. He looked rather solemn. His appearance and image wasn't unfamiliar to many citizens of the Lone Kingdom. This was because he had been printed on the front side of 10-pound notes. Of course, people who had never touched 10-pound notes in their entire lives could also see his statue or portraits at Memorial Square. He was the Lone Kingdom's founder and protector, the first king, William Augustus I. This was an entity referred to as he. With the help of the ritual, he had come here directly from Backlund. Bernadette remained impassive. With a flip of her hand, a new item appeared. The item was golden in color, like a miniaturized water flask. However, a candlewick extended out from the mouth of the flask. As Bernadette caressed the surface of the item with her right hand, one that was covered in mysterious and complicated symbols, the candlewick silently ignited. The light it emitted was like a sticky water stream that sprayed upwards, forming a blurry and twisted golden figure. Eternal genie of the lamp, my second wish is to obtain the strength of a knowledge emperor for one day. Seizing the opportunity when William Augustus I had yet to fully descend, Bernadette spoke in a solemn voice. The item in her hand was called Magic Wishing Lamp. It might have come as early as the first epoch. Although it had never been obtained by the 7 churches, it had the corresponding grade 0 sealed artifact number 0-05. This item could grant its owner any 10 wishes, but this was either done in a distorted form, or it came with unpredictable and terrifying outcomes. None of its previous owners had a good ending, including Roselle Gustave. This emperor had warned his daughter that she could use the proper choice of words and make preparations to avoid the harm brought about by the first 2 wishes, but she absolutely couldn't make the 3rd wish. Absolutely not. Meanwhile, the concealed Klein arrived near the secret mausoleum in Awa County without alerting anyone. Although time was tight, he didn't rashly approach the mausoleum by drawing the symbol and opening the door. Instead, he reached out his right hand and grabbed at the air in front of him. After 5 consecutive attempts, the muscles on his arms suddenly tightened, as if he was pulling something extremely heavy. As he retracted his right hand, a figure quickly appeared. The figure's skin was bronze in color. He had a medium build, black hair, brown eyes, and soft facial features. Beneath his right ear was a very thin mole. It was none other than Azek Eggers. However, unlike the Mr. Azek that he knew, the figure's gaze was cold. He wore a deep black robe embroidered with golden threads. He wore a golden bird-shaped crown, as though he was looking down on all living creatures. This was the former Death Consul, a former Sequence 2 angel. Without sizing him up further, Klein reached out again and grabbed into the void. This time, he didn't seem to have pulled anything out, but in fact, he had summoned the former him from 10 seconds ago, the him who was in a concealed state. Then, Klein threw a small metal bottle at his projection and made himself enter the gray fog's historical void. In his past self, his consciousness suddenly came alive and became extremely agile. This concealed Klein brought the projection of Death Consul Azek and came to the secret mausoleum where the entrance couldn't be seen. He took out a small metal bottle and used his spirituality to draw with the blood that shimmered like gems. In midair, he quickly outlined the symbol that Mr. Door had given. The symbol rapidly formed and resonated with a particular point in the mausoleum, expanding into an illusory door. In a concealed state, Klein and Death Consul Azek passed through the door and entered the corresponding secret mausoleum. At that moment, the guards inside had already discovered that there was an intruder and had activated the ritual they had prepared in advance. However, all they could see was the lofty Death Consul. Somewhere in Backlund, the former Duke of Southville, Blink Augustus, was just about to use a ritual to open a passageway and descend into that secret mausoleum when a man beside him suddenly frowned and said, "That's Isaac Eggers." "No, he is very rigid. It's like a historical projection summoned by the secret order scholar of Your Highness, let me go over. Stay here and be wary of the scholar of Your who's lurking in the dark. Although they aren't angels, they're quite troublesome." Blink Augustus was a slightly arrogant elder. His black hair was mixed with silver threads, and he was clean-shaved. Upon hearing that, he laughed and said, "Isn't the scholar of Your just beside him? Although he's in a concealed state, I've already discovered him through the disorder of the surrounding area. He's misleading us, making us think that he's deliberately attacking with a historical projection while his true body has gone elsewhere. In fact, he's hidden beside Isaac's projection. Once this death console attracts the attention he wants, and when we place our main forces elsewhere, he'll use the concealed state to approach the mausoleum to cause destruction. Besides, regardless of the reason, since he's summoned an angel's projection, you won't be able to kill the target in a short period of time even if you carry a grade 0 sealed artifact. If this implicates the mausoleum, our efforts and persistence would have been in vain. If that scholar of Your has done 3 levels of misdirection and really went to another mausoleum, he won't be able to summon an angel from the historical void. You can easily eliminate him." While he said his first sentence, Blink Augustus had already entered the passage through the ritual's activation. The rest of his words were spoken by the phantoms that he had left behind. Inside the secret mausoleum in Awa County, Isaac Eggers scanned the area with an indifferent expression. His body suddenly swelled and transformed into a giant serpent that covered the area above the mausoleum. This giant serpent was both illusory and real, as though it was formed by something incomprehensible to humans. Its entire body was covered with huge dark green scales. White feathers grew out from the gaps, and each scale and feather had strange symbols of different shapes. Just the mere sight of them made one's flesh decompose, turning them into zombies. This was Quetzalcoatl, the serpent spoken of in southern continent myth. His eye sockets were burning with pale white flames as an exaggerated, thick pair of wings spread from his back. Amidst the howling wind, the feathered serpent in midair lunged forward with its upper body and spat out a pale white flame that covered the entire mausoleum. Mr. Isaac's historical void projection is definitely much weaker than before, but it's still very powerful. As expected of the biological son of death, the consul of the Balam Empire. Although the concealed Klein had done a summoning experiment previously at sea, he never expected that Isaac's projection would be so powerful. At that moment, points of faint, gloomy glows flew out of the mausoleum, putting an end to the tidal-like pale white flame's advancement. Following that, they formed a figure. It was none other than the Sequence 2 balancer, Blink Augustus. The moment the concealed Klein saw him, he suddenly turned rigid and stiff. He began acting based on instinct, a result of him returning to the historical void and being outside the secret mausoleum. Then, he teleported to a secret mausoleum under the Tussock River and took out another small metal bottle. In a concealed state, he used his spirituality to draw the blood out to outline the symbol. A few seconds later, the symbol resonated and turned into a door. With his marionettes, Konas and Inuni, he walked in. Of course, in the river and forest outside, he still had marionettes he just converted. A figure appeared near the ruins number 1 in the outskirts of Backlund. Her raven hair was radiant, and her face was slightly round. She looked beautiful, with a hint of sweetness and an outstanding bearing. She was none other than Demonis Trissi. After Trissi approached ruins number 1, she also took out a small metal bottle and drew the symbol provided by Mr. Door with the blood. An illusory door rapidly took shape. Chapter 1146. A real charlatan. As she passed through the illusory door, Trissi hid herself and jumped down from the cliff at the entrance, towards the dark valley below. The secret mausoleum that originated from Blood Emperor Tudor was hidden here. During the descent, Trissi's body was as light as a feather. She lost most of her weight, but her speed was in no way slow. None of the remaining guards noticed that she had sneaked in. Just as Trissi was approaching her target, she heard a voice say, concealment is prohibited here. Trissy's figure instantly appeared out of nowhere. And in the area above the towering mausoleum in the dark valley, there was a man who had appeared at some point in time. This man had a long, rectangular face with a white hairband on his head. He had a mustache that curled up around his mouth, and his brows were extremely thick, setting off his relatively large eyes. He was dressed in formal attire and wore a cloak. The tips of his shoes were extremely long, and his attire didn't seem to match the times. He was the demigod who supported George III, Prince Grove. On the head of this sequence 3 Chaos Hunter, there was a crown made of thorns. Pure light constantly gathered into the crown, interweaving into a sealed artifact 0 to 36. Klein swam beneath the tussock river when an image suddenly appeared in his mind just as he led his marionette, Konas and Nanuni, through the illusory door. A black cathedral stood in front of them with its spacious door opened, revealing a man in a pair of dungarees, a gentleman in a formal suit and top hat, a lady with frilly designs along her sleeves, and a lady whose dress formed flowers with laces. They were suspended in midair, motionless. Caw. 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 Black ravens circled the top of the cathedral, letting out heart-stopping cries. Without making any guesses, Klein felt like he had fallen into a crack on a frozen lake. His body turned cold as his hair stood on end. Countless thoughts surged in his mind as they collectively shouted out a name, Zeradal. In the blink of an eye, Klein instinctively made a decision. He planned to switch locations with his marionettes from the outside world, and directly leave the cathedral in front of him. Clearly, he had encountered a miracle. He didn't enter George III's secret mausoleum after passing through the illusory door. Instead, he had come to a baffling place. In the next second, he discovered that the spirit body threads that were connected to his marionettes had been severed. They were rapidly floating upwards towards the interior of the pitch-black cathedral. If it wasn't for his intuition that exceeded his own level, allowing him to detect danger ahead of time, he definitely wouldn't have been able to react in time. He definitely would have been hung up and become a member of the marionettes. He didn't have time to think too much about it. He quickly controlled his spirit body threads and collected them all, connecting them to himself, forming one circle after another. This allowed him to temporarily extricate himself from the danger, but it also made him lose his marionettes, Konas, and Nanuni, in just a second. The two marionettes' necks suddenly tightened as they were lifted up by an invisible hand before being hung up in the cathedral's interior. Together with the original corpses, they swayed in the wind and produced voices that were different but said the exact same thing: "Welcome back." In Memorial Square, the imagined King George III was still giving a speech. "I will further lower the wealth requirements needed for election eligibility. I will hand over even more rights to the House of Commons." Although the people didn't understand why there was such a development in the speech, it sounded good to them. "These are all bills that have been approved by the House of Lords, but there's no need to tell the public during this speech. It's like the king is emphasizing that he will definitely follow these bills in the future." Audrey was puzzled, but she couldn't come up with a convincing explanation. In the dark and majestic secret ruins number 1 in the outskirts of Backlund, the real George III had already worn a black crown and consumed the potion. His body was transforming towards the shadow of order, extending in a magical state. As for the 9 mausoleums, they were the islands in the sea of nothingness. They were the components of his entire rule. As for the people who were chanting Emperor George III, at the same time during the ritual, there were like countless numbers of lighthouses. Together, they anchored this ruler of Lone, East Balam, and the Rorstad archipelago, making him completely transcend reality and become a part of the shadow of order. During this process, George III's thoughts wandered uncontrollably as though they were being torn apart. "The secret order's Zeradal actually contacted me directly, hoping to provide me with help. He said that he saw some of Gehrman Sparrow's thoughts from the Capim case, the attack on Ailment Maiden, the silencing of Crazy Captain, and Konas Kilgore's disappearance. And his divination results made him cooperate with me, offering to help me guard a mausoleum. There, he waited for Gehrman Sparrow to take the initiative to walk to him, because of his own goals and the law of convergence of beyonder characteristics. He also said that the most important thing to do when dealing with a qualified demigod of the seer pathway is to be patient and determined. What a charlatan. He even brought Abomination Sua. I used my powers to sign a contract with them. Together with the helpers I invited from the Twilight Hermit Order, as well as Grove, who wields a Grade 0 sealed artifact, even if most of the demigods of the military and royal family are fighting at the front lines or protecting Backland, I don't have to worry about the ritual being destroyed. Unless a true deity descends into the real world. And that's impossible. So, I originally wanted to use this opportunity to lure out any resistance, but in the end, I decided to use this opportunity to directly advance. Heh, since Grove still doesn't know about these hidden cards. Well, he has no right to know. In less than 2 minutes, I'll become an eternal god, the Black Emperor who rules over reality. Caw. 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 In the dark world with the ravens cawing, the corpses hanging from the black top of the church descended and passed through the main door. Their eyes were locked onto Klein, who was outside. Almost at the same time, a figure slowly but firmly outlined itself in midair. Without caring about what it was, Klein quickly snapped his fingers while maintaining the special state of his spirit body threads. Paw! A red flame surged out from his wallet and instantly enveloped him. The flame was quickly extinguished, and Klein remained where he was, unable to leap out. He didn't show any signs of being depressed as he immediately activated Creeping Hunger to attempt to teleport. Klein instantly turned transparent as he appeared again, unable to take a single step. His origin and destination had strangely been connected. At that moment, the figure in midair had already taken form. He was dressed in gorgeous clothes, with long chestnut-colored curly hair, blue eyes, high nose bridge, and thin lips. He was none other than the Roselle Gustav from when he was an emperor. He looked down at Klein as countless illusory symbols appeared in his eyes. Klein's mind instantly swelled as he was injected with a large amount of unknown knowledge. His head felt like it was exploding in an instant while his other thoughts were completely occupied, so much so that he couldn't even lift a finger. Instinctively, he allowed that knowledge to split up and become injected into hundreds of worms of spirit. This allowed him to regain his ability to control his body as he quickly grabbed the space ahead of him with his right hand. His arms suddenly sank, and then he suddenly pulled back. When the marionettes passed through the cathedral's door and began their attacks, another 2 figures appeared in midair, dragging out a scaleless, silvery white tail. As he released his right hand, a giant serpent appeared in this dark kingdom. His eyes were bright red and cold, and his body was covered in patterns and symbols. There were countless wheels in the details. Snake of Fate. Actually, this wasn't something that Klein could summon out from the historical void. Instead, it was Wuxia Septon descending with the burning of the paper crane after using the yesterday once more charm. Klein had just used Flaming Jump moments ago to seek help from the Snake of Fate. And the reason why he wanted to grab at something was to conceal his true intentions. It was to prevent the opposing angel from discovering the location of the Snake of Fate, putting Dr. Aaron's family in danger. This wasn't like how he had previously dealt with Amon's avatar back then, as he had no confidence in eliminating all the clues. Therefore, he had discussed with Will in advance on how to deal with such situations. Fortunately, the intent Wuxia Septon expressed indicated that the truth of the summoning from before hadn't been exposed. At that moment, the gigantic snake of Mercury rose up and bit its tail, turning into a mysterious and exaggerated wheel. In midair, 2 figures appeared on both sides of Roselle's projection. One of them was Queen Mystic Bernadette, whose real body was in an intense battle with Sequence 1 hand of Order William Augustus I. The other was formed from pure light, and a pair of shining wings grew on his back. It was obviously at the level of an angel. Suddenly, the 2 angel projections that appeared quickly vanished. The attacks they directed at Klein, and the controlled marionettes, retreated back into the cathedral and were hung up again. Konas and Anuni walked out one after another. With him, they passed backward through the illusory door and left the world with resonating cawing, appearing beneath the tussock river. Snake of Fate. Reboot. The giant serpent's figure vanished as well. Without any hesitation, Klein activated teleportation and passed through countless spirit world creatures to another secret mausoleum. He used the remaining blood to outline the symbol and opened the illusory door. This time, he entered the interior and saw a solemn and dark mausoleum. He summoned the sea god scepter and released a terrifying lightning storm, again and again, destroying the target. Then, he turned around and left the scene. Everything went so smoothly, just like a dream. Yes, a beautiful dream. Klein, who could always maintain his lucidity in dreams, had realized that he was in a real dream created by someone else the moment he entered the ruins where the secret mausoleum was. Chapter 1147 Chaos. Klein pretended not to notice the real dream. As he tried to stop his projection of the death console, he tried to summon another version of himself from the historical void to fool the guards of the Tudor ruins, allowing his body to escape the dream and sneak into the secret mausoleum to achieve his goal of destroying it. At the moment, he could only maintain 3 historical void projections. Death console Azek Eggers was one, his self-projection in a concealed state was another. He couldn't be certain if the leader of the ascetics, Ariana, was considered one. However, to be safe, he had to disperse one of them before he made another summoning attempt. Regarding Ariana's state, apart from suspecting that she had descended in person due to her state, Klein had other theories. Perhaps the leader of the Evernight cloister had deliberately entered a concealed state after sensing that her projection from the past had been summoned while being located in the Amantha mountain range. She had vanished from the real world, allowing the projection to gain sentience. This was completely feasible, especially since the authority of concealment likely gave her a certain degree of control over her historical projections. When it came to a concealment angel like this, Klein was unable to use the feedback from Scholar of Yours maintenance of the historical projection to confirm her true situation. Therefore, he didn't make any changes, so as to prevent any accidents from happening. Just as he was about to summon his past self, the real dream silently disappeared. Everything around him returned to normal. He was standing on a cliff at the entrance. Below him was a dark and majestic mausoleum. An old man with an ordinary appearance was levitating in midair. Under the glow from the moss and the light from the stone pillars inside the cliff, he calmly looked at Klein and sighed in ancient Fasak. You weren't actually fooled by the dream I crafted. This old man's hair was completely white, but it was thick enough. There weren't many wrinkles on his face, and his appearance wasn't anything special. The Spectator Pathways Sequence 3 Dreamweaver? No, at least, he's not an angel. Klein tensed up and didn't respond. He immediately took out his silver adventurer's harmonica and blew into it. No sound was produced, but Rionette Tinker, who was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, walked out. One of the blonde, red-eyed heads in her hands immediately spat out a rectangular diamond-like charm. Another head chanted in ancient Hermes, yesterday. Yesterday once more. Miss Messenger was borrowing strength from her past self. Compared to a sequence 1 Snake of Fate, the power she borrowed could last longer. However, the charm didn't change at all. In midair, the elder in the gray robe gently chuckled and kindly reminded them, "Don't use ancient Hermes in front of me." Hermes. This is Hermes, the one who lived since the second epoch and created ancient Hermes? An angel of the Spectator Pathway. The origin of the psychology alchemists. Klein was first shocked before he realized something. Hermes was participating in the battle, so it was unlikely he had a strong desire to stop him. No, perhaps he is deliberately acting to lower our guard. Beyonders of the Spectator Pathway are the best at manipulating the hearts of others. Just as this thought flashed through his mind, Rionette Tinker's other 2 heads began chanting in Jotun and Elvish, yesterday. The rectangular diamond-like charm was instantly ignited by a transparent flame before fusing with the void. Rionette Tinker's body began to rapidly expand as the 4 heads in her hands flew up and landed on her neck. The four heads became illusory one after another. In an instant, Rionette Tinker transformed into a huge cloth doll that resembled a castle. She was dressed in a black Gothic dress with countless mysterious symbols and sinister vines. Her eyes were blood red. She swept his gaze across ancient Hermes. She opened her tightly shut mouth but didn't make a single sound. The spectator pathway's angel flashed with a faint light, turning into a plump, white rabbit. Ancient Bane, transformation curse. The rabbit didn't panic at all. Its body began to swell, becoming half the size of a mountain. One stomp was sufficient to trample him to death. To an angel of the spectator pathway, merely believing in their strength allowed them to be powerful enough without being at a disadvantage due to their appearance. As the rabbit turned into a monster, a subtle change happened in the ruins. Reality and illusion intertwined, making Rionette Tinker a little confused as to whether she was in a dream or in the real world. Klein could differentiate between the two. While he had noticed that, not only was Miss Messenger in a mythical creature form, but the surface of the rabbit's body was covered in grayish-white scales. All sorts of patterns intertwined together, forming three-dimensional symbols that seemed to connect to the mind. Angels are truly terrifying. They use their complete mythical creature form right at the start. As Klein sighed, he didn't even dare take a second look to gain more knowledge. Firstly, he didn't have the time to do so, and secondly, his level wasn't high enough. Seeing a complete mythical creature form would definitely lead to being affected and receiving some negative effects. This was something he had to avoid in a dangerous battlefield. Taking advantage of the battle between Miss Messenger and the gigantic rabbit that had transformed into a dragon, Klein used the strong winds to head for the secret mausoleum. As he recited a particular honorific name in Jotun, he reached out to grab at the air. First time, failure. Second time, failure. Third time, still a failure. Just as one fat, white rabbit after another appeared in Klein's island of consciousness, causing him to elevate his consciousness to fight back and be unable to take multiple things into consideration, he instinctively reached out his right hand and finally touched a particular image in the historical void. As he pulled back his arm, the image quickly outlined itself. She was a woman wearing a dark-colored robe and a wide hood. She had a beautiful face and slightly dull black eyes. This was the concealment angel of the Church of Evernight that he had met before. Later, he found out in the foggy town that this was Mother of the Sky, the daughter of the ancient god, Phlegria, and suspected to be the vessel for the goddess's descent. Since he was able to successfully summon the ascetic leader, Ariana, from the historical void in one try, Klein definitely thought of trying to see if he could summon her. He had been chanting the honorific name of the Evernight goddess. The employing of historical void projections by scholars of yore had a difficult-to-overcome restriction. It was that he was unable to summon something that involved the uniqueness. However, objects that were merely a vessel of a deity's descent depended on how much of the deity's power was carried by the corresponding historical void projection or if it involved the uniqueness. Similarly, if he wanted to summon a mon, it was impossible to summon the actual body, but an avatar would work. To be safe, the person who he summoned was the one who had smiled at him during the Great Smog of Backlund, and he succeeded after 3 attempts. Of course, if it wasn't for the goddess's tacit approval, or perhaps providing some level of help, he might not have succeeded given 100 attempts, 1,000 attempts, or even 10,000 attempts. The beautiful lady didn't look at him, the summoner. Instead, she turned her head and looked down at the secret mausoleum. The entire underground ruin quaked as the dark and majestic mausoleum began to shake. Ripples appeared as though it was about to be moved into a concealed world. At this moment, 2 arms extended out from the outside world. One was pressed towards the gigantic doll, Rionette Tinker, while the other spread out its fingers to grab at Klein. These 2 arms were more than 10 meters long. They were pitch black on the surface, flowing with sticky liquids. Some of them were strangely protruding, some had skulls as heads, 3-dimensional eyes, or barbed tongues. Abomination Sua. The remaining guards in the underground ruins went crazy. Some raised their swords to kill their companions, or they raised their guns, aimed at themselves, and pulled the trigger. Klein's skin began to crack, and his consciousness was disturbed by a sensation of madness. He was unable to respond effectively. The concealment angel he summoned retracted her gaze through pure instinct, and she looked up at the two arms that seemed to come from the depths of a nightmare. Tremendous fear caused Sua's arm to tremble slightly. Not only did he fail to grab hold of Klein, he was even cursed by Rionette Tinker, causing him to be covered in green fur. Immediately following that, they began to fade as they struggled with all their might, trying to escape their concealed states. And at this moment, 3 figures appeared in midair in the underground ruins. They were Emperor Roselle, the first lone king, William Augustus, and the abstract angel formed from pure light. The historical void projections summoned by Zeradol followed closely behind. With so many angels descending at the same time, just the effects from their auras alone caused the entire space to quake, not to mention the intense battle they were engaged in. In an instant, the pitch-black mausoleum shook even more vigorously. There was even an obvious crack on its surface. Klein wasn't surprised at all, because this was his last contingency plan. When the enemy was too powerful and prepared, preventing him from creating an opportunity, then it was best to draw everyone together while destroying the mausoleum, thus creating chaos. This was the inspiration he got from the encounter outside Biyao City. Back then, Abomination Sua and the byproduct of the Artificial Death Project attacked remotely while Sea King Kotman, Miss Messenger Rionette Tinker, and a demigod from the Rose School of Thought had participated in it, resulting in the collapse of an innocent mountain. At that moment, Klein wanted the secret mausoleum in this ruin to be like that mountain. He didn't believe that angels could control the damage to their surroundings when in an intense battle. And the lineup this time far exceeded the previous one. It's still not enough. Then let's make it a little more chaotic. As he controlled his spirit body threads to prevent them from floating upwards, he dodged and sensed the mysterious space above the gray fog. Using his basic control over it, he made it tremble slightly. In midair, a grayish-white fog appeared as the majestic palace appeared faintly. Sapphira Castle. In an instant, the sky above the Holy Wind Cathedral in Backlund turned dark, as if a storm was brewing. A bird with dark eye circles watching over the tussock river downstream moved its gaze. In the outskirts of Backlund where ruins number 1 was, Demoness Trissy had been robbed of several powers and suffered serious injuries. She was on the brink of death. Bang! She slammed against the cliff, almost embedding herself into it. Blood was everywhere. At this moment, she took out an item. It was a rectangular diamond-shaped charm. Yesterday once more. Chapter 1148. Not late. There were very few chances to use charms in high-level battles. No one would take the initiative to leave an opening for their opponent while they chanted the incantation. The reason Trissy was able to complete the corresponding action was because she had ignited wicked black flames from the inside out. As for the black flames, they seemed to absorb all the heat in the surrounding areas, causing thick ice crystals to form. Beyond the ice crystals, there were almost invisible spider webs that wrapped around them, forming huge cocoons. Relying on the 3 layers of defense, Trissy managed to buy almost 2 seconds, so she took out the rectangular diamond-shaped charm and chanted, "Yesterday." The transparent flame ignited amidst the wicked black flames. The diamond-like charm silently disintegrated before merging with the void. This was something Klein had specially provided to the Demoness, so as to allow the damage from the 3 prongs to become the main assault point at any time. Trissy immediately saw the grayish-white fog and realized that the scenes in the past were like stars, densely packed together. There were scenes of the young him wandering the streets, coming under the control of the mafia, swindling, cheating, and stealing from others. He later joined the Theosophy Order and became an assassin. There, he enjoyed ending lives and the bloodshed, instigating others to tear off their masks and reveal their true bestial nature. Due to various reasons, he had no choice but to become a witch. She began creating catastrophes, and it was arranged by the Demoness of Pleasure that she would become Prince Edisac's mistress. Realizing that she was becoming less and less like herself and that she was slowly losing herself to the pleasure, she felt extreme fear and yearned to escape. However, having fallen deeper into hell, she experienced immense pain and chose to be extreme. With a thought, the scenes magnified and occupied her entire vision. Under the light, the lawn outside the window was bright, and the horses were walking slowly. The holes of the golf course could still be vaguely seen, and inside the house, there was an antique cabinet blocking the view from the door. The past Trissy stood at the edge and looked out, wearing a sapphire ring on her left hand. At that time, she wasn't even a sequence 5, and she didn't have the strength the current her needed to borrow. However, she had a ring from the Demoness sect that was closely related to the primordial Demoness. This ring was the thing that Trissy wanted to borrow. All of a sudden, the intricate ring that was inlaid with a sapphire gem appeared on Trissy's pinky. And unlike in the past, the present Trissy had fused with the mark and submitted to the primordial Demoness. She had been greatly enhanced as a sequence 4 demigod. In other words, even though she wasn't a robust deity's descent vessel, she already had the qualifications to be one. And that sapphire ring allowed her to temporarily grasp a certain amount of initiative. Looking at the scenes in the past, the cocoon formed by Trissy's spider silk cracked inch by inch. The thick ice crystals silently melted as the wicked black flames corroded. She raised her left hand, closed her eyes, and smiled as she placed the sapphire ring between her eyebrows. The ring melted like metal as it flowed into Trissy's head in a surreal manner. At that moment, the wicked black flames were completely deprived by Prince Grove as a burning white spear of light shot out. At the front of the spear, 2 pure white wings spread out as they embraced the tip of the spear, like an angel, sealing off the surrounding space, and preventing the target from escaping. At that moment, Trissy opened her eyes. They were a deep black color. Her hair flared up one by one, each becoming as thick as a snake. The outer layer was slippery and diabolical, with clear black and white eyes embedded at the ends, or heads that looked like venomous snakes. Their mouths were slightly open as they flicked their tongues. The spear that was condensed from pure light stopped in front of Trissy, as though it was being pressed down by an invisible hand, making it difficult for it to advance even an inch further. It quickly turned grayish-white in color, turning from incorporeal to corporeal, as if it was carved out of stone. With a whoosh, the spear rapidly plummeted to the edge of the cliff, shattering into countless tiny pieces. The grayish-white color around Trissy rapidly spread out in every direction as if it had a life of its own. Wherever it passed, the stones became hard while everything else turned to stone. The various rituals that had been set up in Ruins No. 1 were now tainted with grayish-white colors, preventing the angels guarding the other secret mausoleums from discovering the changes and coming over immediately. Prince Grove was instantly surrounded by a grayish-white aura that emanated out of the void. With him only being capable of using the crown of thorns to maintain a small safe zone, there was no way for him to use any prohibition powers. Trissy, whose eyes had no borders marking her whites from blacks, didn't even look at her opponent. With her snake-like hair blotting out the sky, she took a step towards the secret mausoleum at the bottom of the dark valley. Boom! The ground began to shake violently as a dull thud sounded from deep within. Red asteroids with fiery tails appeared out of nowhere as they flew past Demoness Trissy and smashed at the mausoleum. In an instant, this ruin was inundated with catastrophes. George III, who was at the critical moment of his advancement, sensed this and immediately felt a strong sense of confusion and anger. With great difficulty, he split off some of his strength, and with the help of the preparations he had put in place, he forcefully distorted the surrounding area and isolated the dark and solemn secret mausoleum from the real world, preventing earthquakes and meteors from approaching the target. Boom! Boom! Amidst all kinds of catastrophes, the cliffs crumbled one by one as the ruins began to collapse. George III's angry voice sounded from the secret mausoleum that formed a world of its own. Are you mad? For a sequence 4 to forcefully accept the power of a true deity, the only outcome was death. Trissy laughed. The skin on her face had been pushed to its limits. Inch by inch, they crumbled, revealing the blood and flesh that was squirming wildly underneath. This extremely terrifying demoness scoffed and said, "Isn't the ending of a lovely story supposed to have all the bad guys die? For example, you, or me, before Trissy could finish her sentence, she wore that tragic smile on her face as the asteroid plummeted into the twisted secret mausoleum in a bid to destroy it. In another mausoleum, Klein didn't put on a strong front. He quickly ended the connection with Sapphira Castle as though he was praying to the fool for help. The commotion from before had nearly caused all the angels present to stop. Unfortunately, the concealment angel Klein had summoned was a historical void projection. It only continued fighting based on instinct, turning the situation even more chaotic. At this moment, William Augustus I's projection pulled out a silver sword and pointed ahead before slicing downward. There was no need for him to say anything else. The chaos in the ruins came to a stop as the battlefield was divided into different sections. Hermes faced the beautiful and impassive lady. Abomination Sua suppressed Rionette Tinker, the historical void projections of Emperor Roselle and the Angel of Light surrounded Klein. William I stood at an isolated spot, ensuring that none of the aftershocks attacked the mausoleum below. As expected of the Hand of Order, Klein's pupils dilated. Without thinking, he reached his right hand into the inner pocket of his clothes, and he stretched out his left hand to borrow strength from his past self. The Death Consul, the Evernight Cloister's matron, and the Concealment Angel were figures that exceeded Klein's own level. Be it summoning or maintaining them, it was a terrible burden on his spirituality. He had no choice but to borrow some power from his past self before his spirituality completely dried up. This way, he was filled with fake spirituality once more. For the next 5 minutes, it was no different from real spirituality. Then, Klein saw light. The angel formed from pure light, which also had illusory wings on his back, made the layers of light surge towards him like a tidal wave, drowning him. In the bright white sea of light, something suddenly appeared. It rapidly plummeted and approached the secret mausoleum. It was a dark-colored book that consisted of goatskin. Groselle's Travels. Using his ability to split into worms of spirit, and his enhanced ability to shape-shift, he shrank into bookmarks made of flesh, embedding themselves into the book, using it to block the endless light's purification and melting effect. But even so, he was still severely injured because the light still could illuminate part of his body. This wasn't the end. Standing right beneath Groselle's Travels was Emperor Roselle, dressed in gorgeous clothes, waiting there with his hands raised. Without second thoughts, Klein could only activate the first method he knew of to protect himself, hiding in the historical void. Boom! A loud thunderclap boomed outside the ruin. It rumbled in the distance in the beginning, but by the end of it, it was ringing in one's ears. Klein, together with the projections in the historical void, and all the living beings in the ruins were awed and turned stiff. Instantly, the sea of light dimmed. But no, there was a figure that wasn't affected, the concealment angel of the Church of Evernight. The beautiful but dull-looking lady took the opportunity to phase her body, transforming into many symbols that symbolized concealment and terror. She extended the strange world, enveloping Hermes, Rionette Tinker, Sua's arm, the Angel of Light, and William Augustus I within. Although Klein had summoned a historical void projection, a watered-down version, some essential parts remained. The chaos that Klein was anticipating was finally here. As for George III's other helpers, such as that King of Angels, they were still in other mausoleums. The moment the nearly transparent world took form, the angels inside began to resist. Amidst the chaos, the strange world easily tore apart. However, with the remnants of the angel's power being directed, the lady rushed out and headed for the secret mausoleum at the bottom. Boom! An even louder clap of thunder rang out. Emperor Roselle, who had attempted to stop them, was once again awed, unable to make any further attempts. In an instant, the dark and majestic secret mausoleum was hit. The cracks on its surface sank deep, causing its dark interior to present itself. In these rifts, blood appeared out of nowhere. Some were bright red, and some were dark. Boom! 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 Having restored his human form, Klein held Groselle's Travels while collectively launching air cannon with his scattered worms of spirit. The mausoleum, which was already on the verge of collapse, had finally collapsed, and even more blood gushed out. With the destruction of a mausoleum, George III's advancement ritual was no longer stable. He lacked the key pillar of support. If only one mausoleum was under attack, he might have been able to rely on his tenuous connection with them to put up a resistance to a certain degree. But now, he had suffered too intense of an attack. His already incorporeal body suddenly boiled, unable to maintain the distortion outside. The mausoleum that was isolated from reality finally appeared in front of Trissy. On Trissy's tendril squirming face, the corners of her mouth curled up. Backlund City, Memorial Square. My subjects, the stern and old-fashioned George III with his mustache was finishing his speech when there was a loud explosion. His flesh and blood transformed into a flurry of fireworks that sprayed into the air. Chapter 1149 Escape. When Audrey and company below the platform saw this scene, it was as if they were admiring a large magic show. For a moment, no one realized what had happened. A few seconds later, the scene started to turn disorderly. Amidst screams, the king's guards all rushed up the platform. The cabinet ministers and the House of Lords nobles subconsciously sought a place to hide, or they mustered their courage to follow the guards to check the scene. Audrey looked on in a daze. She wasn't too surprised, but she felt that it was surreal. If Mr. World paid strong attention to someone, it meant that they were being watched by Mr. Fool. And to date, none of Mr. Fool's goals had failed. This was the will of a deity. In the other municipal square in Backlund, Melissa, Benson, and company also heard the explosion before realizing that the king's speech had come to an abrupt stop. After a moment of silence, people began to turn rowdy as they began breaking out into a discussion amidst hushed whispers. Fear of the unknown and fear of the future slowly occupied their hearts. In the outskirts of Backlund, inside ruins number 1. George III's mind was a blur. He felt something that couldn't be resisted inside his body as a volcano of extreme madness erupted in his mind. It was changing his body while distorting everything around him. Indistinctly, he saw a huge black throne, one which he was sitting on. He wore an emperor's crown, looking down upon the real world with great pride. He had reign over his subjects, and he was equal to the deities. He reached out his hand in an attempt to grab this future, but countless curses and attacks of unknown origins kept striking him. It prevented him from touching that future. No, George III's hand, which had faded, hung in midair as his consciousness tore apart as his body mutated completely. Trissy, who had been reduced to a blob of flesh and blood, enveloped that shadow of order using her countless thick snake hair. Boom! In the outside world, in the area corresponding to ruins number 1, large amounts of dust were stirred up into the sky like the thickest of smog. Boom! The area became a humongous crater that was connected to the Tussock River, opening up an inlet for the river water to rush in. Rumble! High up in the sky, lights dimmed as a storm containing immense horror enveloped the area. Further away on a mountain peak, 2 figures watched this scene without anyone speaking a word. They were the demoness of unaging Katerina, who was wearing a pure white robe, and the pale, hooded red angel evil spirit. After 2 seconds, Saintess of White Katerina sighed softly and said, "The reason we wanted to find her was because Primordial told us that she has strong inclinations towards self-destructing." The red angel evil spirit listened silently as his expression twisted slightly. "I know who interfered with my response." Katerina thought of various answers, but she couldn't be sure. Ultimately, she chose to remain silent. The red angel evil spirit slowly said a word, "Evernight." After a pause, he suppressed his emotions and added, "Otherwise, I would have long found Trissy cheek." Without waiting for Katerina to respond, the red angel evil spirit turned around and left. In another ruin, a hint of joy flashed past Klein's eyes when he saw the secret mausoleum collapse and spill out copious amounts of blood. But it was ephemeral because he had to turn his attention back to his situation. With George III's ritual failing and him not becoming Black Emperor, it meant that his goal had been achieved. What followed next was to escape. At that moment, while the mausoleum's destruction didn't have any significant impact, Rionette Tinker followed her agreement with Klein, and she didn't stay any longer. She first entered the spirit world and fled deep inside it. The power she borrowed from herself was coming to an end. The maintenance of the beautiful concealment angel had already reached Klein's limits. After it transformed into a strange world, it naturally disappeared. Inside the half-collapsed ruin, Klein faced the arm of Abomination Sua, Hermes from an ancient time, Emperor Roselle's projection, William Augustus I's projection, and the Angel of Light projection, as well as the thunder that pointed at an unknown location. Any one of them had the ability to easily kill him. And for him to summon a historical void projection at the angel level wasn't something that could succeed within a few attempts. Without any hesitation, Klein's body turned incorporeal as he attempted to hide in the historical void. At this moment, a vortex suddenly appeared in the grayish-white fog in his vision. It was made up of countless transparent maggots that extended out transparent and slippery tentacles. Zeradol. Zeradol's actual body had appeared. He had been waiting in the historical void for Klein. At that moment, Klein's action of entering the historical void could no longer be reversed. All he could do was watch helplessly as he was pulled in by the vortex and thrown into the center. He wanted to snap his fingers and ignite another paper crane, but he realized that no flames could rise up there. Having probed him once, Zeradol was confident of his trump card. By relying on his level suppressing him, and the authority of bizarreness, he made Klein unable to control the flames anymore. In addition, Klein's intuition told him that the destination after making a teleportation attempt was mysteriously connected to the vortex formed by the transparent maggots. He was unable to escape, nor could he summon enough helpers. However, Beyonders of the seer pathway never perform unprepared. The vortex formed by the transparent maggots slowly spun as it received a visit initiated by Klein. The transparent and slippery tentacles swam over in an unstoppable manner. They reached towards him, but they only wrapped around the ancient book covered in dark-colored skin. The blood on the book's surface hadn't completely faded. Groselle's travels. At the most dangerous moment, Klein pricked his fingers, allowing his blood to flow onto the surface of Groselle's travels. Then, with a whoosh, he entered the book world and temporarily escaped the fatal trap set up by Zeradol. The moment he entered the book world, he immediately stretched out his hand and grabbed forward, pulling out a marionette that he had temporarily possessed from the historical void. Vin Rambus. He had once tested that he could summon the projections of true history here. After all, it belonged to Sapphira Castle, and praying to the fool in the book world wasn't obstructed. Of course, if that didn't work, he had other ways to resolve it. He could summon Justice Audrey, who existed in the book world's history. In short, he needed a mid or high sequence Beyonder from the spectator pathway to bring him into the sea of collective subconscious, into the city of miracles, live seed, and into the hall of truth. Time was of the essence, so the faster, the better. This was because he had no idea how long before this sequence one would be able to grasp the secret of Groselle's travels, much less whether the other party would forcibly descend into the book world. He could only race against time. Vin Rambus, who was wearing a formal suit and a dark red bow tie, held onto him with a stiff expression. He directly entered the sea of collective subconscious formed by countless shadows. With the power of a manipulator, they quickly shuttled through and arrived at the City of Miracles, live seed, in seconds, appearing before the entrance of the Hall of Truth. Klein released his control over his marionette, Vin Rambus, and under the nudge from the strong winds, he ran through the door. As he passed by the colorful murals, his inner voice resounded in the hall. The chances of summoning 0-08 here should be higher. Using it to draw or write at the end of the mural on the left side can affect the real world. Through its arrangements, I can make Zeradol make a mistake, allowing me to find a safe escape route. No, it's still easier to let Amon's avatar join the battle royale and implicate Zeradol. That will be easier to fulfill. It's no wonder the goddess wants to bait Amon into Backland. The mural on the right represents the book world. I can use 0-08 to draw another temporary door for me to leave. While flying, Klein's right hand kept grabbing at the void ahead. 5 times, 10 times, 20 times. When Klein borrowed strength from his former self, his right hand suddenly sank as he dragged out a dull classic quill. 0-08. In the next second, Klein arrived in front of the huge pillar that was multiple arm spans wide. This had a clear sense of being worn down by time. It was the throne of the dragon of imagination, Ankwelt. Klein circled around the stone pillar and arrived at the end of the mural. He raised the quill, 0-08, and was about to write. He had never tested for any changes in using 0-08 in here before. He was afraid that it would result in an excessive accident and alert Amon's brother, making his ploy of preventing George III from becoming the Black Emperor to be detected in advance. At this moment, he no longer needed to bother about such matters. He could wholeheartedly weave the development that he needed. Suddenly, 0-08, which was about to begin writing, disappeared. It disappeared before it reached the time limit. What's happening? Klein felt alarmed. He then realized that his words in the Hall of Truth hadn't been projected. There was silence all around him. With his spiritual perception triggered, Klein slowly turned around and saw that the time-worn rock had turned into a 100-meter-tall cross at some point in time. In front of the cross was a huge, blurry figure standing there. Facing everything with its back, it was observing all life with compassion. Inside the Hall of Truth, there were rows of black, high-back pews, but only one supplicant. The supplicant had his eyes closed as he sat in the middle of the first row. He wore a rather simple white robe with a pale gold beard that covered half his face. His hands were clasping a silver cross in front of his chest as he wore a genial and calm look. Adam. Twilight Hermit orders chair, King of Angels Adam. Klein didn't even know when he had arrived. At this moment, Adam looked up, revealing his clear, limpid eyes that resembled a child's. He slowly stood up, speaking with a calm expression. George III's death causes Lone to suffer a heavy blow. Unable to sit idle any further, Intis decides to take this opportunity to launch an attack. This war officially develops into a war that sweeps through the world. Can you accept such an outcome? Chapter 1150 Mad Dash. Although there was no concept of temperature in the Hall of Truth, Klein still felt a chill down his spine when he heard that. He felt a wave of heat, and he wanted to defend himself, but when he opened his mouth, he didn't know what to say. For a few silent seconds, his figure was reflected in Adam's limpid eyes before he said with some difficulty, I accept it. But I will try my best to minimize the damage caused by the war in the future, so long as I'm still alive. He paused and asked in a deep voice, is this the price you exacted for the bestowment? Back when a certain ascetic here mentioned your true name, you had already noticed this book and secretly made arrangements? Adam, who was dressed in simple white robes, didn't respond. He walked towards the mural on his left and stopped in front of one of the murals. He looked up slightly and quietly admired it. On the mural, a book consisting of goatskin flew up into the clouds and landed in a gigantic claw. After watching for a while, Adam said with a warm voice, you may leave. He immediately felt that he had been rejected by the Hall of Truth, the sea of collective subconscious of the City of Miracles, and the book world. He involuntarily floated up and flew out of the area. During this process, he saw Adam return to the front of the black pews. Holding the silver cross pendant, he closed his eyes and prayed sincerely to the huge and blurry figure. Outside the sea of collective subconscious, an illusory door silently appeared. It stood in midair and was connected to the outside world. The book world also began to ostracize him, squeezing him out of the huge door. Suddenly, Klein returned to the real world and returned to the grayish-white fog. He was in the state he was in prior to entering the historical void. Unlike before, he hadn't been locked down by the whirlpool formed by countless transparent maggots. As for the slippery tentacles that were almost invisible, they wrapped around Grozel's travels slightly and disappeared into thin air. Without having time to lament over the loss, Klein's thoughts raced, and he made a choice almost purely on instinct. He leaped into the grayish-white fog in another direction and hid in a shattered spot of light. This was the so-called historical void. Klein regretted it the next second because Zeradol's slippery and terrifying tentacles had extended out from the grayish-white fog. The countless translucent maggots were no longer formed a spinning whirlpool as they disintegrated into a tidal wave that surged towards him. Zeradol could actually fight in the historical void. This was the suppression effect that high-level members of the same pathway had against lower-level ones. A demigod of the same seer pathway was always the best choice for dealing with a seer demigod of a lower sequence. Without any hesitation, he ran through the spots of light and into the depths of the fog of history, just like his advancement. Scenes of the secret mausoleum collapsing, Baklan's suffering an air raid, and the tragic Great Smog flew behind him. However, the dangerous premonition in his heart didn't weaken at all. Instead, it intensified significantly. He even saw a thick shadow getting closer and closer, covering himself. This was a tidal wave formed by the transparent maggots and the slippery tentacles. Klein ran as fast as he could, constantly chanting the honorific name of the Evernight goddess in Jotun in his mind, hoping to be saved. This was the only thing he could do, and she was the only existence that could save him at the moment. Of course, if he knew of Amon's honorific name, he would definitely attempt to provoke this blasphemer. Only by messing things up would he have a chance of surviving. Roselle's declaration as emperor, the modification of the steam engine, the battle of the violated oath, the White Rose War, and the 20-year war flashed past one by one. Klein realized that his body was being increasingly covered by shadows, and his consciousness was gradually slowing down. He had a feeling that he was having his spirit-body threads controlled. At this moment, hounds of Fulgrim ran out of the grayish-white fog's various spots of light. They were covered in pitch-black short fur, their eye sockets burning with dark red flames as the corners of their lips extended to the back of their heads. This group of monsters-like creatures, the Sapphira Castle Keepers, ran past Klein and rushed behind him. He immediately regained his lucidity. Fuck. He cursed himself, his eyes slightly red as he continued running, with his vision blurred. He went from the 5th epoch to the 4th epoch, and from the 4th epoch to the 3rd epoch. The massive shadow that resembled the tidal wave behind him paused for a few seconds, then it continued surging towards him as if nothing had happened, drowning out the historical voids he passed through. Klein didn't hold back in expending his spirituality. He used all his might to run with the light spots that he had lit in the fog of history. He ran from the 3rd epoch to the 2nd epoch until he arrived at a lonely fragment of light. Around him was a withered forest and a normal tomb. This was the period of history where giant King Ormur buried his parents. As for the tidal wave that was formed by Zeradol, it didn't seem to understand this history well enough. It stopped at some unknown era and didn't manage to catch up. At that moment, Klein's spirituality was almost exhausted. And in the fog of history, he could only borrow power from the current void. But clearly, there was no past projection of himself here. And when his spirituality was exhausted, he would have no choice but to leave the fog of history and return to the real world. When that time came, he would be facing Zeradol again. Phew. Klein exhaled and pulled out another paper crane. He snapped his fingers and lit it. However, after waiting for a few seconds, he failed to see the snake of fate, Wuxia, appear. In the historical void, there's no way to use ordinary paper cranes to contact Will. Why hasn't Amon appeared yet? As his thoughts flashed, he could only repeat in Jotun, the Evernight goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. You are also the Lady of Crimson, the Mother of Concealment, the Empress of Misfortune and Horror, Mistress of Repose and Silence. After holding on for a few seconds, he suddenly had an idea. Hence, he didn't hesitate to leave the fog of history and return to the real world. Just as his figure appeared, his spirit-body threads floated into the air and was grabbed by a slippery, transparent tentacle. And opposite him, another figure appeared at the same time. It was the barefoot, linen-robed ascetic leader, Ariana. Based on Klein's abilities, the angel-level historical projection he had summoned must have disappeared. Therefore, the person who came was undoubtedly the actual body. The Evernight Cloister's matron glanced at Klein, and instantly, he vanished under Zeradol's tentacle. Klein entered a concealed world belonging to Ariana. It was night time, and it was a monastery with many ancient buildings erected. There was a huge and holy crimson moon hanging high in the sky. Using the experience gained from their past cooperation, Klein immediately used traveling to appear in the crimson moon, leaving this concealed world in order to appear elsewhere. After returning to reality, Klein had already distanced himself from Zeradol. Hence, he didn't hesitate to use traveling to directly leave. And having held Zeradol back for a short period of time, Ariana entered a concealed state and left the battlefield. Boom! A terrifying thunderclap boomed as the transparent tentacle that attempted to reach out to where Klein had disappeared suddenly retreated, disappearing along with the actual body. Having teleported to the sea, Klein couldn't be bothered to borrow strength from his past self. He first summoned a paper figurine from the historical void and shook his wrist. Most of the items he had with him had been destroyed when he became a bookmark. It was unknown where he had lost his marionettes, Konas and Nanuni. Of course, they might have evaporated under the illumination of the Angel of Light. Pa! The paper figurine burned with scarlet flames as it leaped up into the form of an illusory angel that had layered wings on its back. It embraced him and removed any traces. Then, he activated traveling once again and left the area. In the secret mausoleum in Eastchester County, William Augustus I and Queen Mystic Bernadette managed to sense the death of George III, either through the changes in order or via their clairvoyant abilities. The latter didn't stay any longer. Her body suddenly separated like a collection of soap bubbles that reflected light, scattering in all directions before bursting. William Augustus I wasn't in the mood to stop or chase after her, but he didn't feel much pain. After making a huge detour, Klein, who had used Angel's Embrace 3 times to remove his traces, finally returned to Backlund secretly. It was probably the safest place. He didn't return to the apartment he had previously rented. Instead, he found a hotel in the Backlund Bridge area and got a room. Of course, he didn't forget to change his appearance, height, and temperament. The more ordinary and common his appearance was, the less attention he would garner. After entering the room, Klein endured the mental fatigue and physical trauma he received, and he began to chant the honorific name of sea god Calvetua. He planned to take 4 steps counterclockwise and head above the gray fog. He wanted to use his true vision and the real Angel's Embrace to confirm his surroundings to eliminate any latent dangers. Fortunately, Zeradol should have signed a contract with George III, so he can't leave the mausoleum he was guarding as he pleases. Otherwise, I would most likely have become his marionette in that chaotic battle. The appearance of him, an abomination Sua, exceeded my expectations. Klein heaved a sigh of relief and took 1 step in a counterclockwise manner. He opened his mouth and chanted in Mandarin, the exalted. Suddenly, Klein's body trembled. His voice came to a halt as he froze on the spot. In his line of sight, a figure had appeared on a chair beside the full-body mirror in the room. He was a young man of medium build, wearing a dark-colored jacket and trousers. He looked like a mixed-blood man with Lone and Balam roots. This was the marionette that Klein had lost, Winner Anuni. Anuni smiled as he faced Klein's pair of eyes that could no longer move. Don't randomly leave your marionettes around. They can be tracked. As he spoke, he slowly stood up. He casually took out a crystal monocle from his pocket and slowly wore it on his right eye. Chapter 1151 Desay in a hotel in the Backlund Bridge area. Apart from his thoughts that still belonged to him, Klein could no longer control anything else. Even his eyeballs couldn't move. He knew very well that this was likely a deeper level of parasitizing. In this state, he could only look ahead of him in fear and despair. He watched as Anuni, who was wearing a monocle with a smile on his face, changed into Amon's original form. He took a step forward counterclockwise and opened his mouth to speak in Mandarin in an articulate and mellow manner. The immortal Lord of heaven and earth for blessings. Did he steal my thoughts just now, or my ability to speak Mandarin? It should be the former, otherwise, he wouldn't be able to grasp this ritual. Klein's pupils couldn't widen as he watched. He felt an unprecedented sense of anxiety. As though sensing his emotions, the monocled man turned to look at him and smiled. He then took another step counterclockwise and whispered in Mandarin, "The Sky Lord of Heaven and Earth for blessings." Following that, this blasphemer carried on the ritual with great familiarity. With every step he took, and every chant of the incantation, Klein's heart sank even deeper into a dark swamp, as though he could no longer see any light. The celestial worthy of heaven and earth for blessings. When Amon took the final step and recited the final incantation, a boundless grayish-white fog suddenly appeared in front of Klein. He heard layers of pleas. There was no need to listen carefully, as he understood what it meant with his spiritual perception. After advancing to Scholar of Yore, he had obtained basic control over Sapphira Castle. No matter who it was, even if they had the correct ritual and corresponding incantation, they needed to obtain his permission to enter the world above the gray fog. Reject him. Klein was instantly delighted as this idea clearly surfaced within him. However, just as he had this thought, he had forgotten it. Standing there, he looked like a statue carved from stone. His intention of rejecting Amon had been stolen by him. Klein once again felt despair, but the grayish-white fog in front of him and the prayers in his ears didn't disappear. Klein was first taken aback before he understood what was going on. "I understand. I have to head above the gray fog myself and control Sapphira Castle to give him permission to enter. There is no default option." This thought was like a straw which Klein grabbed at without any hesitation. It prevented himself from sinking into the water silently without anyone hear him cry. Although he still didn't know how to make use of this matter, his intuition told him that a slim possibility and his only hope could be hidden in this detail. At this moment, Amon stopped the attempt and cast his gaze at Klein. Clearly, he had failed to successfully enter Sapphira Castle. This angel of time adjusted the monocle on his right eye and smiled without any change in expression. "Honorable Mr. Fool, your idea of saving yourself is very interesting." Amon had used the standard loan language, but every word seemed to be able to stir the powers of nature, creating one explosion after another in his mind. How is he so sure that I'm the fool and not the blessed of the fool? Klein felt his body turn cold as the hope that had just surfaced sank into the water once more. How am I certain? Amon sked and pulled the chair from before over and sat down. He pointed at the round stool opposite him and said, "Sit down, don't stand on ceremony." The moment he'd finished his sentence, Klein couldn't help but stride forward and sit on the round stool. Amon looked around the room and grabbed Klein's black silk top hat. He put it on his head and said with a smile, "Did you think that I wasn't aware that the ritual would be unsuccessful? It hasn't been long since Sapphira Castle produced an anomaly, so how could I forget? I just want to see your reaction. And you subconsciously felt despair and instinctively rejected me. That was very interesting. If you weren't the one who was called the fool, how could you have such thoughts? Dear Mr. Fool, am I right?" As he repeated the 4 rhetorical questions, Amon looked rather pleased, as though he was an old hunter who had caught the fox's tail. "I fell for his scam." Only then did Klein realize why Amon wasn't disappointed at all. He subconsciously wanted to deny it, but after some thought, he calmly said, "Kill me." I can speak now." Klein tried to control his body, but it was completely impossible. In the next second, he was prepared to recite the honorific name of the Evernight goddess, but this thought was immediately lost. The thin-faced blasphemer Amon pressed down on his right monocle and maintained his excited state from before. "So that you can be reborn in Sapphira Castle, the more I talk to this fellow, the more mistakes I make." Klein shut his mouth tightly and didn't say another word. When Amon saw this, he shook his head with a smile. "There's no need to be so afraid. Actually, there's no bad blood between us." Sitting on the round stool like a doll, Klein was stunned for a moment, but he didn't respond. Amon leaned forward slightly and looked into his eyes before continuing with a smile. "The only conflict we have is regarding Sapphira Castle. But do you really wish to shoulder that fate? Aren't you worried that the original owner of Sapphira Castle will revive within you? This was something Klein was very concerned about, making him at a loss for words. Amon pinched the crystal monocle and didn't urge him to answer. He smiled and said, "If you give me Sapphira Castle, all the problems will be resolved. That way, whether the original owner of Sapphira Castle comes back to life, or if the corresponding fate can be shouldered, the person who needs to worry is me, not you. Also, I'll be the one to take over the subsequent arrangements of my zealous brother, Dor, and Lil, Zeradol's pursuits and the benediction of Evernight. And you will be freed from all this and just stay as a Sequence 3. Heh, why would I want to kill you? What's the point of killing a Sequence 3? Even if I want to retrieve the characteristic, it's still expendable. My prey will only be Palez, Lil, Zeradol, and Dor. The rest will purely depend on my mood. As for the organization that you established, I can also help you maintain it. It's very fascinating and interesting. If you think this price isn't enough, then I can make you my blessed. Heh heh, are you not pretending that the fool is the angel of time Amon in the City of Silver? This can turn into a reality in the future. I will lead them out of the forsaken land of the gods and see the light outside. When the time comes, you'll still have a chance to advance to Sequence 2 and become an angel. This is practically taking over all my worries and hardships. There are only benefits left. Klein, who didn't have a huge desire in becoming a true god and controlling Sapphira Castle, heard his heart palpitate with excitement. If he hadn't known that Amon was the #1 master in deceit, he would have agreed to it on the spot. But in the end, he still said without any expression, "Kill me." Is that the only thing you know how to say? Amon said without any signs of anger. He looked at Klein with piqued amusement. To him, this was a very interesting matter. It was completely understandable that he would encounter difficulties during the process. They only served to make success even more fulfilling and delightful. I'm just a heartless broken record. By lampooning, Klein eased his depression and despair. Instead of answering, he asked, "How do you know that the City of Silver thinks that you are the fool?" He didn't dare to say that the City of Silver still suspected that the fool was the god that Amon believed in, afraid that he would provoke him. Of course, if Amon was the type of person who would lose his intelligence after being provoked, he definitely would have tried doing so. This was because he now suspected that, after gaining initial control of Sapphira Castle, he would be reborn above the gray fog after his death. Unfortunately, Amon wasn't a king of angels from the storm pathway, but a god of trickery that gave even the true deities a headache in the 4th epoch. Amon laughed and said, "Do you think I only have 2 avatars in the City of Silver? Since you, the fool, and the hanged man have intervened, then I'm happy to quietly watch from the sidelines." The City of Silver is still accommodating Amon's avatar. Who's the fellow who was parasitized? Yes, previously, the members of the Giant King's Court's exploration team weren't parasitized. This is something that can be confirmed. As his mind tensed up, Klein felt that it was only natural. This was because Leonard had once told him that seeing one Amon meant that there were a bunch of Amons lurking around. It wouldn't just be a small handful. Without much thought, Klein tried hard to come up with an attempt to create an opportunity. "You didn't rob me of my destiny directly because you can't handle it right now?" Amon nodded frankly and said, "Yes, that's why I want to make a deal with you peacefully. But since you rejected my offer, I can only bring you to see my real body, to a sufficiently safe place. Then, your destiny will be taken away. When that happens, your ending will not be as good as I just said earlier." As he spoke, the black-haired, black-eyed man with a broad forehead and thin face slowly got up and walked towards the door. With that, Klein stood up and followed behind like a puppet. As he reached out to open the door, Amon seemed to recall a question. He pressed down on the crystal monocle and turned to look back at him. "What's the 4th line of your scholar of your honorific name?" In mysticism, every existence's corresponding honorific name wasn't that strict. As long as one used the correct format and certain descriptions to narrow the scope to prevent any ambiguity, they could point towards the corresponding hidden existence. This was also why quite a number of heretics who knew anything about mysticism could randomly make up honorific names while still receiving feedback. Of course, if it wasn't for the honorific name given by the hidden existence, there was no way to enjoy receiving feedback. Whether they established a connection or not depended on whether the existence was interested in the supplicant. Previously, Amon had used his understanding of the scholar of Yorn German Sparrow, and the powers of the Marauder Pathways Sequence 7 cryptologist, to restore the full honorific name that could point accurately to German Sparrow. However, he didn't attempt to pray and use the automatic response to establish a connection to lock onto Klein's location, because his godhood intuition told him that there was a problem with the fourth sentence, dooming him to fail. The fourth line of Klein's honorific name flashed across his mind, but he had no intention of telling Amon. At that moment, Amon opened his mouth and read out his thoughts. Protector of Backlund magic and drama performers, this so-called angel of time and a blasphemer fell silent for a few seconds after saying it out loud. Then, he smiled, very happily. After laughing, Amon adjusted his monocle on his right eye and said with a smile, "To be honest, this is all very interesting. Are you really not considering becoming my blessed?" Klein opened his mouth and gave a familiar answer, "Kill me." Chapter 1152 Error. Upon hearing Klein's reply, Amon smiled and shook his head. As he reached out to open the door, he casually asked, "How did you think of such an honorific name?" "It needs to have a certain connection with myself, but also be able to avoid others from using the prayer's automatic response to lock onto me. There aren't many such honorific names." Seeing that his identity had been exposed, there was no need for Klein to hide it any further. Furthermore, he hoped to use such a conversation to grasp an opportunity. At the same time, his mind raced as he began thinking about how to save himself. "I've been deeply parasitized. If I have any thoughts that aren't beneficial to Amon, it will be easily sensed and detected by him. Today is Saturday, and it's almost Monday again. If the fool suddenly stops the tarot gathering without any warning, the other members will definitely be terrified, nervous, and confused. Here, those who have the means to contact the world will definitely attempt to summon the messenger to ask for the reason. And once Miss Messenger approaches me, she will be able to discover the existence of Amon. Then, she can use the yesterday once again charm to recover to her peak condition. With the complete strength of an angel, she has a sizable chance of rescuing me from Amon's avatar. The most important thing for me now is to persist and live for 2 days. Yes, since Amon can't steal my fate right now, why did he try to trade peacefully? Even if I agreed to it, he wouldn't dare to let me go above the gray fog to grant him permission. That would mean that I'm free from his control and able to Sapphira Castle to effectively purify and make a counterattack against the parasite. Is the agreement itself a switch, and there's no need to follow up on it? Amon deliberately didn't mention this. As expected, it was a scam. Having grasped a sliver of hope, Klein decided to stall for time as long as possible for the next 2 days. The focus of Amon was still on the honorific name that no human and angel could think of. As he walked out of the room, he scratched his chin and said, "Have you provided any protection to Backlund's magic and drama performers?" "I've protected a trick master before." Having made plans, Klein was much more cooperative than before. He answered simply, "I'm a magician myself. I've performed many times in Backlund." The monocled Amon nodded. "Barely counts." He then walked out of the hotel room and went down the stairs to the street. Like a servant, he followed behind without any abnormalities. Looking to his left and right, Amon pinched his monocle and sighed with a smile. "How regretful." "What's there to regret?" Klein asked in puzzlement. "I've already been caught by you. What else do you have to regret?" Amon pressed down on his silk top hat and maintained his smile. "You can make a guess. If you can guess correctly, I can give you a better ending." Klein didn't believe in his promise at all. In order to not be tricked into revealing more secrets, he shook his head and said, "I can't guess it." "How boring," Amon said simply. He clenched his right hand into a fist and lightly tapped on his monocle. From the pedestrians, the trees by the side of the street, the sparrows on the rooftops, the rats in the muddy corners, and all kinds of living creatures in the air, illusory worm-like figures flew out, returning to Amon like stars. This son of a god status instantly rose to the level of an angel. As for Klein, he raised his left hand, and the human-skinned glove suddenly turned transparent. This was the activation process of traveling. At that moment, the only thing on him which was real was creeping hunger. The rest were made by using the powers of a faceless, as well as the glove using flesh and blood as the material. Seeing that traveling was about to begin, Klein was taken aback as he blurted out, "Why didn't you teleport in the room?" He had expected Amon to leave Backland with him. After all, this was a place where even a king of angels had to be wary of. However, he couldn't understand why he would open the door, go down the stairs, and leave the hotel in such ordinary fashion. The eye behind the monocle swept across Klein as the corner of Amon's mouth slowly curled up. "I've already answered you. What a pity that you didn't seek help from Palez." This angel of time had an obvious smile on his face, but there was no emotion in his black eyes. It made Klein shudder. He's certain that I have some connection with Palez Zoroast. Is it because of what happened the last time? No, stop it. Klein attempted to cogitate, trying his best to control himself from thinking too much, so as to prevent his thoughts from being stolen by Amon. Amon glanced at the panicking passers-by on the street in an impassive manner before looking up at the gray sky and saying, "I can only wait for the next opportunity. The most important thing now is to bring you to that place." As they spoke, both of them turned transparent at the same time and vanished from the hotel's entrance. None of the people who came over felt anything amiss. After passing through countless indescribable spirit world creatures and overlapping layers of different saturated colors, Klein and Amon appeared above the sea. Beneath their feet was a huge fissure. The blue seawater had been cut off as they plummeted deep into the bottomless darkness, like a waterfall without ever filling it. This was the entrance to the ruins of the Battle of Gods. With a thought, Klein asked, "You're taking me to the forsaken land of the gods?" The magnificent waterfall was reflected in Amon's monocle. He nodded slightly and casually replied, "That's right. When we get there, even your messenger won't be able to sense you through the contract." The forsaken land of the gods was clearly separated from the spirit world. Only by relying on Sapphira Castle could a connection be made. "Amon knows what I'm planning to do." The flame of hope that was ignited in him was extinguished by the cold reality. He couldn't find another way to save himself for the time being. At this moment, the levitating Amon muttered to himself, "If my mausoleum in Backland hadn't been destroyed by the Church of Steam, we could have used the abyss as a springboard to head there directly. We wouldn't have to go through all this trouble." Klein guiltily changed the topic. "The abyss is connected to the forsaken land of the gods?" "No." Amon shook his head and said with a relaxed expression, "But I can use some of its characteristics to go anywhere. I heard that there were some nasty changes in the abyss." With a thought, Klein probed. Amon turned his head and glanced at him without concealing his curiosity. "You're actually aware?" "Yes, I once thought of exploring the abyss." Klein didn't speak further, afraid that the King of Angels of the Marauder Pathway would discover that he could read Roselle's diary. At this moment, Amon suddenly laughed. "You want to explore the abyss? What's so funny about that?" Klein was very interested in what had happened to the abyss to begin with, thus, he took the opportunity to cooperate with Amon in an attempt to know more. Just as he finished speaking, he suddenly had a new idea. Using the conversation he had with Amon, he could grasp more historical secrets to speed up his digestion of the scholar of your potion. That way, he could try using it to deepen his control of Sapphira Castle and escape from his current predicament. This thought flashed through his mind as he quickly restrained himself and stopped thinking about such matters. In regards to his question, Amon chuckled and said, "Your visiting of the abyss is like offering yourself as a beautifully packaged gift to someone who wants it." Dark side of the universe? Klein was first alarmed before he made a guess. Amon nodded. He was originally the only surviving ancient god, the devil monarch, Farbati. Now, Without finishing his sentence, Amon leaped and jumped into the huge, illusory rift with the strong winds. With that, Klein lost the support of the wind and fell straight down. After an unknown period of time, the water that resembled a fountain surged upwards rapidly, throwing him and Amon to the other side of the severed face. Just as he entered the ruins of the Battle of Gods, Klein was hit by bright sunlight. He suddenly heard a series of intense and crazy ravings. It was like a thin needle that pierced through his eardrums and stabbed into his brain, filling every thought with immense pain. As for the worms of spirit that formed his mythical creature form, they gradually changed, as though they were about to give birth to a degenerate consciousness that didn't belong to him. The true creator's ravings. With regards to this, Klein could barely withstand it, but it was difficult for him to hold on for too long. There was no way for him to go too far in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. At this moment, he saw that the monocle on Amon's right eye absorbed all the light around them. It became unusually bright and white. Then, a thick darkness ruled the sky. Amon directly stole the day of the ruins of the Battle of Gods. In the darkness, this angel of time's avatar brought Klein to an island and made him sleep against a stone pillar. Soon, Klein arrived in the hazy dream world. He saw the projection of the giant king's court, which was filled with an epic feeling, opposite the black cloister and the cliff. Amon, wearing the black silk top hat and crystal monocle, appeared beside him. With a relaxed smile, he pointed at the projection of the giant king's court that was frozen in the sunset. That's the entrance to the forsaken land of the gods. After some thought, Klein raised his doubts. Don't you need to enter a dream at a specific location to open the entrance? He couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope again. He thought that it would be great if Amon wasted a week or two of his time in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. That's right. Amon didn't deny what Klein had said. He casually said, if you wish to open the entrance, you have to travel on a ship to the core of this ruin's waters. This might take more than a month, and you will experience many dangers that you're currently unable to withstand. As for me, I don't have to. Is it because you're the son of the creator? Klein guessed in deliberation. No. Amon had one hand in his pocket as he turned to walk to the black cloister's entrance. In chaotic places like this, order is in shambles, and the laws governing them have mutated. There are too many things that can be exploited. As this angel of time walked, he turned to look at Klein. The Marauder Pathways Sequence 0 has a very abstract name, error. It was named by my father. He once used a strange word of unknown origins to represent it, bug. When translated, it's a Trojan horse of fate, the slug of time, the loopholes in rules, the manifestation of all errors. Chapter 1153 The Sunset Tunnel Font Big Middle Small Previous Index Next Add Bookmarks Error. Bug. Is that the essence of the Marauder Pathway? As he came to a realization, Klein also confirmed one thing. That was that the ancient sun god, the City of Silver creator, Amon's father really did come from Earth. The word that Amon said was standard English. Fellow Earthling, your two children have really caused me so much pain. If only they were all like Bernadette. As he lampooned inwardly, he asked curiously, you want to use this dream world's loophole? Klein controlled himself and didn't use the term bug to describe it, lest it would arouse suspicion in Amon due to his overly ordinary fluency when speaking the word. He would then reveal a trump card for no reason. Faced with a king of angels who could steal his thoughts and deeply parasitize him, he had very few trump cards to begin with. He had to make good use of every single one of them. Who knew when they might end up being effective? At that moment, Amon had already walked out of the black cloister. He had one hand in his pocket, and without doing anything, the heavy door opened automatically, as though it was welcoming the arrival of a distinguished guest. You can think of it that way, but in actual fact, it's a little more complicated than that. Amon didn't show the might of a blasphemer at all as he casually answered Klein's question, this dream world doesn't have any errors, or rather, loopholes. It's just that, due to the clashing of remnant divine powers, some places appear more chaotic. And I can use this chaos to create a loophole. As the huge door that was prepared for the giant was completely opened, Amon pinched his monocle and walked into the hall, venturing deep inside. During this process, he smiled and gave a more in-depth explanation. You should know very well that this cloister is composed of dreams. Yes, it comes from the dreams of different living beings in the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. After some thought, Klein added, it might also be left behind by some dreams from the past. At that moment, the man and angel walked on a winding black staircase. The light of dusk shone through the stained glass from high above, bringing with it a feeling of burning holiness. Amon touched the human skull engraving on the railings and smiled as he took in the surroundings. Generally speaking, the area you enter this dream world is where you end up when waking up, regardless if you're in the dreams of other living beings in other seas. Unable to nod, Klein could only express his opinion with words. That's right. And after I create a loophole, I can wake up in the corresponding location by entering other dreams. Clearly, this cloister is much smaller than the sea ruins outside. The structure is even narrower. Perhaps we can reach our destination in a few minutes. There was a hint of joy in Amon's tone. To him, creating and exploiting loopholes was a joyous matter. Amon is actually able to use such a method to quickly pass through the ruins of the Battle of the Gods. We won't even be wasting an hour or two, much less 1 or 2 weeks. As expected of a king of angels, the blasphemer of the fourth epoch. The glimmer of hope that was generated in Klein vanished instantly. He wasn't sure if Amon had deliberately not mentioned it in advance, so as to enjoy watching the bubbles of his target's hope being popped time and time again. Or if he didn't care about such trivial matters. All he could do was to curb his heavy depression and say, "You want to control the core dream of this illusory world?" He remembered Queen Mystic Bernadette mentioning that she didn't dare enter the black wooden door in the deepest depths of the cloister. "It's not me, it's us," Amon replied with a smile. He seemed to suddenly recall something. He raised his hand to adjust his monocle and asked with interest, "Why did you put a monocle on your marionette?" "I didn't even need to prepare one myself." Feeling awkward for a second, Klein thought for a second and decided to answer truthfully, "Not long ago. In order to digest the Bizarro sorcerer potion, I deliberately wore this monocle in front of the Red Angel evil spirit." Amon, who was walking down the stairs, suddenly paused. He turned his head to look at Klein and smiled. "Very interesting." This angel of time said thoughtfully, "To think that Medici hasn't completely died. Next time, if I encounter him, I'll disguise myself to look like you, and then I'll wear a monocle in front of him again." Poor Saron Einhorn Medici. As a whole king of angels, can you not be so senseless? Is this the so-called god of mischief? When Klein heard that, he felt wistful, not knowing what to say. Amon pressed down on the crystal monocle and asked, "Did you wear this monocle on your left eye?" "How did you know?" Klein was shocked, imagining that Amon had stolen the scene from the fog of history. "How did I know?" Amon said with a smile. "There are 2 possibilities. Firstly, it's because you're of a beyonder of a low level, so you're definitely not a match for that fellow Medici. You were afraid that if your disguise was too realistic, then you would incur a fatal subconscious attack and deduced that you would be better of doing so. Secondly, if you had the intention of imitating me and ended up doing an accurate imitation, then I might be able to use the ripples generated by fate to detect the incident. Since I didn't notice it, it must mean that the monocle was worn on the wrong spot. Make a guess. Which possibility is it? I will choose the most dangerous possibility, regardless of whether it's true or not. This way, I will be even more careful and cautious in the future when it comes to matters like this. Of course, there must be a future first. Since Amon didn't show any signs of viciousness or oppression, Klein had unknowingly let down his guard and felt that Amon was an easygoing king of angels. But now, He suddenly snapped to attention as he came to a realization that this was a trait of a master swindler. The second possibility. Klein gave his answer. Amon didn't say if he was right. He reached the bottom of the stairs and came to the lowest level of the cloister. He stopped in front of a black wooden door covered in strange patterns. I've been here before. Once this door is fully opened, the power inside will shatter the dream world in its entirety, Klein said as he attempted to extract more historical secrets from Amon. Amon reached out for the handle, his thin face impassive as he said, "This is my father's final dream. The corresponding location is where he perished. The ruins of the Battle of Gods was where Ro's redemption attacked the ancient sun god, the source of the cataclysm." When Klein heard that, he tensed up as his thoughts raced. With regards to this answer, after understanding the formation of Ro's redemption, he had a corresponding theory regarding the various abnormalities in the ruins of the Battle of Gods. He wasn't too shocked now, and the scholar of your potion had even been digested to a certain degree. Immediately following that, he let out an indescribable sigh. This was the closest he had gotten to the ancient sun god. Previously, when he saw it through dream divination, they were separated by a distant stretch of both space and time. The ancient sun god and Emperor Roselle were the protagonists of an era, but in the end, they ended up miserable. The ending was tragic. Roselle still has the means of being revived. I wonder if this former creator had any similar setups. Dark Angel Sasser? The true creator? Amidst his thoughts, Amon opened the black wooden door covered in strange patterns. There was a sea inside, and the blinding sunlight shot straight at it. There seemed to be a rich gold color hidden in the waves. Klein didn't understand what the thick gold represented previously, but now, he had a preliminary idea. It was the blood of the ancient sun god. Before he died, he was affected by the power of the Evernight and fell into a dream. He dreamed of his body being torn apart, staining the sea with blood. Clang! As the black wooden door opened, an unimaginable aura emanated out, causing the entire cloister to violently shake, as though it had encountered an earthquake that could destroy this world. Amidst the dust and collapsed stone bricks, the two of them entered the golden sea through the wooden door. Following that, he felt his spirit body melt as his psyche evaporated. In seconds, he would become fertilizer for the dream. At this moment, bright and pure white light shone out from Amon's crystal monocle, instantly shattering the dream world. He returned the day he had stolen to the ruins of the Battle of the Gods, allowing the place to turn from night to day. At the same time, his and Klein's figures turned somewhat transparent. Then, they appeared in midair above a sea that was dyed golden. The temperature here was higher than what Klein imagined, but it wasn't as dangerous as the dream. Or rather, the sea in the core region of the ruins of the Battle of the Gods was separated into safety zones due to various clashes of divine power. As long as one didn't blindly explore the area, then there wouldn't be too much of a problem. In the next second, Amon's monocle drew in all the light from his surroundings, making himself appear extremely bright. Day was stolen and night had fallen once again. After the two landed on an island in a safe zone, they once again entered the dream world. This time, they appeared outside the black wooden door covered with strange patterns. Amon adjusted his monocle, which he wore on his right eye, and pulled it with his left hand, stealing the distance between the entrance and the cloister. Both of them took a step forward at the same time, leaving the cloister and arriving at the edge of the cliff. Opposite them was the projection of the giant king's court that was frozen in the dusk. Klein originally thought that Amon would follow procedure and chant the corresponding honorific name, but to his surprise, he only raised his right hand and snapped his fingers. The clouds that separated the two mountains instantly boiled as they parted to the left and right, revealing an invisible dark rift at the bottom. The projection of the giant king's court on the opposite side suddenly sucked all the rays of light from the sunset over, letting them surge forward and fill up the deep crack. Hence, in between the two mountains, an orange-red light road appeared in the clouds. "Let's go." Amon gave a low laugh as he leaped down the cliff. With the fluttering of his clothes, he landed on the passage formed by dusk. Unable to resist, Klein could only follow and jump down the cliff. Chapter 1154 I'll give you a chance. The path that was formed by dusk didn't seem to contain anything, but after Amon and Klein landed one after another, they didn't continue falling, as though they were walking on the ground. This time, Amon didn't steal the distance. Instead, he brought Klein along as they approached the majestic projection of the giant king's court. From time to time, he would observe and admire the beautiful scenery. Walking above the sea of clouds, they walked along a sunset bridge with the legendary palace in the distance. It was supposed to be a joyful and refreshing matter, but Klein felt as though he was walking into the abyss, doing so one step at a time. The more he struggled, the deeper he fell. Once he entered the forsaken land of the gods, many things that he relied on would be useless. Before long, Amon and Klein arrived at the projection of the giant king's court and stood in front of the tallest building. On one side of the building was a steeple, and on the other side was a spire. The main door was far more than 10 meters tall, with it being mainly a grayish-blue color. It was covered with symbols, labels, and patterns. It was where the giant king lived, the place where Dark Angel Sasra slept. Klein glanced at the pitch-black hole to the left of the door, roughly determining that the door in the dream didn't need a key to open. Otherwise, the true Creator's believers wouldn't have been able to pass through. After all, the actual key back then was in Vice Admiral Iceberg's collection room. Next, we'll be able to enter the forsaken land of the gods once the door is opened. However, we'll definitely attract the attention of others by doing so. Amon chortled and took a few steps diagonally to the edge of the door. We won't open the door, but instead directly head over. As he spoke, the Angel of Time raised his hand to adjust his monocle. A dark blue color appeared in the corner of the grayish-blue door. It was an illusory door without any sense of being corporeal. The door-opening power of an apprentice is a very low-level ability, but it's perfect when used here. Amon lowered his right hand and introduced in satisfaction. Taking 2 steps, he passed through the illusory door. There are no useless beyonder powers, only useless beyonders. If I directly push the door open, I'll draw the attention of others. But from who? The true Creator? His holy residence, his divine kingdom should be somewhere in the forsaken land of the gods. If I can lure him over and let him clash with Amon, I might be able to find a chance to escape. Without any ability to control himself, Klein followed behind Amon without leaving much of a gap, stepping into the blurry dark blue door. The moment he stepped through, he felt the world spin around him. Even his spirituality seemed to be torn apart. After the abnormality disappeared and his condition was restored, he realized that he was on a beach that was soaked in the glow of the sunset. The sand and stones here were all black in color. Deep blue waves surged over from afar as they crashed into the coast, one wave after another, but they didn't produce any sounds like they should have. They were quiet, like a grand illusion. This sea is an illusion. Coming in would probably result in one appearing here, but it's not necessarily the case for leaving. According to the principle of reciprocity, if one wants to leave, they can only open the residence of the giant king, where Dark Angel Sasra is in deep sleep. With a sudden realization, Klein turned his head and looked in another direction. It was a mountain bathed in dusk. On it were countless palaces, towers, and many majestic city walls. This was the legendary giant king's court. Even if the city of silver could find a path that leads to the beach, it would be meaningless. From the corner of his eye, he saw that Amon had changed his image. He wore a black classical robe and a pointed hat of the same color. He changed from being a gentleman from the present era to an ancient mage that originated from the 4th or even the 3rd epoch. With a thought, Klein continued looking at the giant king's court, which wasn't too far away. He casually said, "Dark Angel Sasra is sleeping in the palace of the giant king." Amon stood to his side as he looked in the same direction and said without any change in expression, "I know. I've entered the giant king's court and even visited the graves of Ormer's parents. As expected. One of Klein's guesses was finally confirmed. He deliberated and said, "What answers you searching for one?" "You can make a guess." Amon continued looking at the giant king's court and laughed. "If I had any idea, I wouldn't need to ask you." After thinking for a few seconds, he said, "Some secrets of the first epoch?" "You can say that," Amon replied without much concern. Klein hesitated for a moment before saying, "Aren't you curious about Dark Angel Sasser's condition?" "I am." Amon didn't change the direction of his gaze as he said with a smile, "But compared to me, there are still many people who are more interested in that, my zealous brother, the Hanged Man, the Dragon of Betrayal, as well as Evernight, Storm, and White. I want to see who's the first one who isn't able to hold back. Heh, if I can steal everything of importance inside at the critical moment, their expressions will definitely be very interesting." This thought. The reason for stirring up such a huge matter was purely to cause trouble, to gain some excitement. Klein frowned slightly and realized that Amon's values were different from that of humans. This is a natural mythical creature. Completely different from humans. Why can I frown on my own? Just as he came to a realization, he sensed that something was missing in his body. He subconsciously turned his head to look at blasphemer Amon. There was a semi-translucent worm of time with 12 rings in Amon's hand. He smiled as he looked into Klein's eyes and said with some anticipation, "Since we've already arrived at the forsaken land of the gods, there's no need to worry about external interference. I'll give you a chance. Before I reach my true destination, I will no longer parasitize you. You can use every method that you can think of to escape, and I will try my best to stop you. Good luck. Don't disappoint me." For a moment, Klein couldn't believe what Amon had just said. He suspected that Amon was bluffing him. But when he thought of Amon's behavior all this while, he felt that it was something that was in line with his character. "All right." As his thoughts raced, he took a deep breath and solemnly replied under the orange glow of the sunset. Backlund, Parliament House. Due to King George II's sudden self-destruction, none of the nobles and members of Parliament were allowed to return to their respective homes. Instead, they were gathered here to receive heavy protection from the 3 churches and the military. Dressed in a pure black dress, Audrey stood behind the railing on the 2nd floor and quietly looked down. As the matter had happened too suddenly and lacked any prior warning, she still found it surreal despite receiving some indication from the world Gehrman Sparrow. She seemed to have transcended reality and was watching a performance. Her father, brother, and the other nobles and members of Parliament were gathered in cliques as they occupied different small rooms. From time to time, one would walk out of the small room, bringing with them the stench of smoke and their gentlemanly attire as they rushed to another discussion circle. The ladies and madams sat in the lounge. Most of them had yet to return to their senses as their eyes were dazed and their bodies trembling. The parliamentary staff and the military's middle and low-ranking officers were running about everywhere, transmitting information from different places. A soldier dressed in a red shirt and white pants walked in from the outside and handed a stack of paper to the officer in charge of the hall. The officer glanced at it and immediately called for his assistant. He pointed at the small room where Earl Hall and the rest were in. Without asking anything, the adjutant took the documents and ran towards his destination. All of this happened in a very quiet environment. Only the sound of footsteps and faint whispers echoed in the air. It was as if it was a huge oil painting drawn on the canvas of the real world. The gorgeous decorations, dark colors, dim lights, and the expressions on everyone's faces created an extremely heavy atmosphere. Audrey pursed her lips slightly and looked at it for a while. Her mood was still at a nadir, and she only managed to maintain her calm by relying on placate. Why would Mr. World deal with the king? The death of the king will definitely bring deep hatred. It doesn't matter what sequence the king is, because he has never shown it. This doesn't affect the overall strength of the kingdom, but this incident is enough to explain one thing: the 3 churches, royal family, and military have fractured apart. The internal strife is quite serious. The situation with Lone will be very dangerous. Its enemies will definitely not let this opportunity go. As her thoughts raced, she saw a man in a black coat rush into Parliament House. He suppressed his voice and started talking to the officer in charge of the lobby. As an experienced spectator who could observe the subtle expressions and body language, reading lips was undoubtedly Audrey's strength. As she watched, she interpreted the corresponding content. Intis has used the excuse of conflict in the borders of the Homasis mountain range to gather a large number of troops there. Audrey bit her lip lightly as that familiar feeling of not belonging there arose again. It was as if she had seen a novel's description play out in the real world. The grayness of the sky seemed to grow thicker. No one spoke in the house where the Moretus lived. Benson stood behind the oriel window with a solemn expression as he looked at the people rushing down the streets. It was unknown what he was thinking. Melissa sat on the sofa beside the coffee table. She lowered her head and looked at the crude machinery she made. It was as if she had become a statue. Sigh, the situation has become even more chaotic. Benson exhaled as he touched his hairline. He turned his head back and forced a smile. Regardless, Backlund is definitely safer than most places. Melissa didn't raise her head. Instead, she said with an ethereal voice, Klein found a good job, and our lives gradually improved. In the end, an accident took him away. We moved out of Tingen, and you got a job as a civil servant. I entered university and started on the correct path. In the end, war broke out. It wasn't easy for us to get used to this environment. We were praying that the war would end early. In the end, the king was blown to pieces. Having said that, Melissa slowly lifted her head and looked at her brother with a confused expression. Benson, is it that difficult to obtain and maintain a better life than what we had before? Chapter 1155 Walking in the Dark Backlund, Eastborough. Furs, who had just returned from the land of ice and snow, was wrapped in thick layers of clothing. She looked at the burning charcoal stove in front of her as if she had fallen into a terrible environment again. She couldn't help but shiver a few times. George III is already dead. The things that happened before will definitely come to an end. Perhaps we can move out of this place and head to Northborough or Hillstonborough. The houses there have fireplaces. Zio sat on a chair opposite her and similarly stared at the warm furnace. She replied with a slightly confused expression, let's wait another week or two. To be honest, I still can't believe that George III was killed so easily. I didn't have time to do anything. This bounty hunter, who had become a judge, sounded disappointed, confused, and puzzled. It felt as though she had lost her motivation in life. Furs temporarily forgot about the damage caused by the cold as she consoled her, I don't think that this was done by Gairman Sparrow. It was done by those people who used Shermaine. They were the only ones investigating the secret motives of George III. Your actions have contributed to his death to a certain degree. It's as if you had exacted your revenge in an indirect manner. There shouldn't be any more surveillance or suppressive measures placed against your family. You can try to start a new life. If you have the chance, you might be able to use proper channels to make an appeal for your father. Upon hearing the last few sentences, Zio raised her head. Yes, the situation is getting more and more chaotic now. I'm worried that they'll be affected by the war. Furs, do you think it's safer to be in Backlund, or in an ordinary city that isn't near the borders? Furs thought for a few seconds and shook her head calmly. I don't know. She added, I plan to ask Mr. World. He must have a better grasp of the overall situation. Do you still remember? He warned us beforehand that something would happen around George III, and to avoid approaching him. In addition, Furs also wanted to ask where the next stop of her travels would be so that she could make preparations early. Yes. Zio nodded instinctively. Furs flipped through the newspaper she supported with her knees, and she drank the coffee she had left. Then, she slowly got up and entered the room inside. She prayed to Mr. Fool in a low voice, asking him to pass her questions to the world Gairman Sparrow. In the forsaken land of the gods, near the giant king's court. Without being parasitized at a deeper level, Klein followed Amon to the foot of the mountain. In the frozen dusk, they circled to the front of the mythical land. Although Amon had given him a chance to escape, he wasn't in a hurry to do so. This was because he knew very well that Amon had the strength and level of at least a sequence 2. He was an angel in the truest sense of the word, an entity he couldn't fight head-on. Besides, a marauder was known as an error, a loophole, a bug. Its powers were very strange, making it impossible to guard against. Klein believed that whatever normal means he could come up with to save himself would be ineffective. I can only stay patient and wait for an opportunity that can be used. During this process, I have to keep making attempts to observe Amon's response. Yes, I still have to take note of a problem. I can't believe anything Amon says. He has already retrieved the worm of time and removed my parasitized state. At least, in terms of my condition, he isn't lying, but this might not be the whole truth. I can't rule out the possibility that he has left a worm of time lurking in my body. He might take control of my body at a critical moment. As these thoughts surfaced in Klein's mind, he chatted with Amon, asking about Dark Angel Sasrer. However, he saw that nearby, in the distance, the dusk was fading away as darkness blanketed the area. Lightning bolts that snarled from time to time lit up half the sky. They had arrived at the boundary of the giant king's court and were about to leave the mythical kingdom. Once I'm in the darkness, I'll either evaporate into thin air or encounter a sudden terrifying monster attack. With a thought, Klein pretended not to know anything as he continued proceeding forward. He went from the orange dusk and into the deep darkness. At this moment, Amon, in his black classic robe and pointed hat, accompanied with a monocle, reached out his hand and pulled back a lantern covered in thin animal hide. Inside the lantern, a candle made of some unknown oil emitted a faint yellow light and a slightly pungent smell. Carry it. Amon threw the lantern at Klein. Klein caught the lantern and fell silent. A few seconds later, he probed, "Where did you get this from?" At that moment, Klein imagined that Amon had summoned a projection from the historical void. Amon pinched the crystal monocle and said with a smile, "I stole it from the human camp up ahead." "Oh, that's the City of Silver's afternoon town camp." It was stolen. Klein's eyelids twitched. He didn't ask further as he carried the lantern into the endless darkness. The dim yellow light was like an invisible defensive barrier as it quickly spread out, creating a warm zone in the dark night. At this moment, the lightning in the sky kept flashing. The gap between them was rather long, and there was almost no thunder. It occasionally boomed. According to the general knowledge he had learned from Little Sun, this was nighttime in the forsaken land of the gods. It was the most dangerous period. As he proceeded forward, he first used the faceless powers which had undergone a qualitative change. Together with creeping hunger, he adjusted his eye structure to adapt to this special environment. Following that, he used his spiritual perception to survey his surroundings. He felt that, in the darkness, there were many eyes staring at him, with creatures of indescribable shapes hidden. However, every time the lightning lit up and shone brightly, there was nothing. He wasn't worried at all about the serious backlash from using creeping hunger while not feeding it. From his point of view, there were only two outcomes. One was that creeping hunger attempted to devour him, but had its thoughts stolen away by Amon. The second was that creeping hunger successfully devoured him, the wearer, allowing him to be resurrected, thus, escaping from his current predicament. The latter was something he was looking forward to, while the former didn't offer any losses, other than leaving creeping hunger somewhat perplexed. After proceeding forward for a while, he saw the City of Silver's afternoon town camp that was built using an abandoned building. Beyond those boulders and walls that were formed by stone pillars, the bonfire quietly burned and illuminated most of the areas inside, making them completely different from the outside world. The members of the City of Silver's exploration team were either patrolling or watching the area under the light's illumination to prevent any accidents. One of them was a dawn paladin who was nearly 2.3 meters tall. He was standing at the top of a stronghold and looking into the distance, wary of the monsters hidden in the darkness. Suddenly, he saw a faint yellow flame coming from afar in the darkness. This Dawn Paladin's pupils dilated as his heart raced. Apart from newborns and children who had yet to receive education, everyone in the City of Silver knew that this land had been forsaken by God. No one else would use fire in the darkness to create light. Even monsters who were good at controlling flames would be hidden in a dark environment before they attacked. As for the other humans, all the cities that the City of Silver had discovered to date had already been destroyed and turned to ruins. There were no survivors. The only outsider they had seen to date was the strange little boy, Jack. And at that moment, a flame appeared in the depths of the darkness, one that was constantly moving. What does this mean? The Dawn Paladin who was standing in the stronghold couldn't think of anything at that moment. He could only feel his body trembling slightly. The dim yellow light slowly approached from afar. It passed by the campsite and headed beyond Afternoon Town. Vaguely, the Dawn Knight saw two silhouettes that belonged to humans. They walked deep into the darkness, and their silhouettes were strangely illuminated by the light. Holding what looked like a lantern, they slowly left the camp and disappeared into the endless darkness. At some point in time, the Dawn Paladin was already holding his breath until the faint yellow light was completely gone. There are other humans? No, they can't be humans. The Dawn Paladin's eyes narrowed as he carefully turned around to inform the elder of the 6-member council presiding over this camp. At this moment, he discovered that one of the lanterns hanging on a stone pillar was missing. This Dawn Paladin's body stiffened as cold sweat broke out on his forehead. As he walked away from Afternoon Town, Klein endured the stares of numerous pairs of eyes in the depths of the darkness. He secretly made use of the powers of a scholar of yore, as well as his connection with Sapphira Castle, to sense the grayish-white fog that was interwoven through history. He had succeeded. This proved that the forsaken land of the gods wasn't isolated from Sapphira Castle. The holy residence of the true Creator, or even the Divine Kingdom, is located in this piece of land. If I were to trigger Sapphira Castle and create an anomaly, would it cause him to cast his gaze over and clash with Amon? He is a true god. I don't have extravagant hopes in escaping in the chaos, but I can seize the opportunity to commit suicide when he is dealing with Amon. With a thought, Klein wanted to make Sapphira Castle quake slightly. In the next second, this thought disappeared. The corners of Amon's mouth curled up slightly as he walked beside him. The hanged man has no interest in Sapphira Castle. Of course, his irrationality might not be constant. Klein didn't have extravagant hopes that his impulsive thought could truly succeed. He mainly wanted to test Amon's reaction and see what his response was. At that moment, he didn't feel depressed, nor did he hide his curiosity in asking a question. The hanged man is referring to the sequence 0 of the Shepherd Pathway? Amon nodded slightly and said, "That's right. This symbolizes degeneration. Of course, if you want to explain it in a positive light, that is sacrifice and responsibility." Klein thought for a moment before probing. "I thought this was a nickname you came up with." Just like Medici. Based on what he knew, the true Creator was born because of Ro's redemption. It was very likely related to the death of the ancient sun god. Therefore, he wanted to know what kind of attitude Amon had towards this evil god, and whether it was the same as his brother. Amon nudged his monocle and chuckled. "I've always respected the gods. To have a blasphemer say this sounds really contradictory." Helpless, Klein put a stop to the topic. Chapter 1156. Thinking most of the areas in the forsaken land of the gods didn't have paths that one would consider normal, but it wasn't that difficult to walk through them. This was because large swaths of the land were barren. Everything was mostly black in color. On the moors, there were occasional sightings of plants that stubbornly grew. They were of a variety of strange shapes and distorted sizes. Klein had no way to tell what they originally were. Around them, in the areas that the lantern couldn't illuminate, the darkness seemed to have a life of its own. It seemed to move silently, as though it wanted to devour everything that they could blanket. As a scholar of yore, Klein just needed one glance from the corner of his eye to see the spirit body threads extending out from the darkness around him. They were illusory, dense, and countless. This meant that there were many monsters lurking in the darkness. These monsters were extremely silent. They stared at Amon, who was dressed as an ancient mage, as well as Klein, who looked like a present-day gentleman. Under the dim yellow light, they walked through the wilderness. With his eyes fixed ahead, Klein casually held the animal hide lantern in his hand, not worried about when it would be extinguished. Just as the two of them were about to leave this barren wilderness and enter a hilly region, a deformed monster of mangled flesh with 2 heads and 5 arms suddenly trembled in the darkness behind them. It had become Klein's marionette. Controlling spirit body threads was silent to begin with, and it wasn't more than 500 meters away. In the next second, the monster collapsed silently, losing its life. Walking to Klein's left, Amon, who was wearing a pointed hat, smiled. He raised his right arm and opened his palm, revealing something. It was a transparent maggot with 3-dimensional patterns. A worm of spirit. This was stolen from the marionette, along with the spirit body threads. Without waiting for Klein to speak, Amon easily crushed the transparent maggot with his fingers. Klein immediately felt a pain that came from deep within his soul. His head felt like it was about to split open. Thankfully, he had gotten used to this feeling from him repeated creating yesterday once more charms and control spirit bullets. He only grimaced without losing his composure. Amon maintained his smile and threw down his palm. "You're too reserved. You can be more daring." Having recovered from the pain, Klein raised his hand to rub his temples, feeling exhausted. Every worm of spirit was calling for him to rest. As he was being chased by Zeradal, the spirituality that he borrowed from his past self had been mostly expended. There was still the continuous traveling after that. By using Angel's Embrace to remove traces, he was already nearing his limit. After he returned to a safe zone, he had planned on going above the gray fog to check on his surroundings before entering a deep sleep and replenish his energy. Alas, he ended up suffering an ambush from Amon, which resulted in him being parasitized. He had been tormented all the way to the forsaken land of the gods. If he wasn't in a perilous situation, he might have fainted or showed signs of losing control. "I need to rest now," Klein put down his right hand and said frankly. He believed that Amon would satisfy his request, because the more he failed at escaping despite trying his best, the more he could satisfy this god of mischief's desire for entertainment. "All right." The monocled Amon's face turned slightly as he said while facing the hillside, "There's a resting place there. We'll arrive soon. Of course, I don't mind if you want to camp out in the wilderness. I just feel that you humans might prefer a place that gives you a sense of security. Let's go there." Klein originally wanted to directly control the flame of the lantern to complete a flaming jump, but his drained spirituality stopped him. He could only follow Amon and rely on his feet to move forward. Along the way, with a mind of asking more questions, he said to Amon, "Why don't you steal the distance to immediately arrive at our destination?" Amon turned his head and glanced at Klein with his monocled right eye. The corners of his lips curled up slightly. "I'm not the one who wants to rest." Klein shut his mouth and quietly walked forward. After about 10 bolts of lightning flashes, Amon raised his hand and pointed diagonally ahead. "We're here." In the shadow of a hill less than 100 meters away, there were a few buildings that looked like half-steeples. More than 10 giant stone pillars protruded out from the ground, reaching only the height of Klein's knees. A few strands of wild grass grew out from the crevices, their blade-like tips were dark red like blood. "There used to be people living here?" Klein rubbed his temples and asked. Nudging the monocle with his right index finger's second joint, Amon smiled and said, "This place used to be a very large city. When the cataclysm happened, the land cracked open and devoured the entire city, leaving behind only these structures to prove that it once existed. The destruction of civilization." This thought suddenly popped up in Klein's mind. He sped up his pace and arrived at the destination where there was strange wild grass. After entering a half-collapsed building, Klein instinctively looked around and observed the place. The grayish-white stone walls that had cracked open had murals that had been washed away by thousands of years. They were already indiscernible, and he could tell that the people in the city believed that entering heaven after death was an honor. After regulating his breathing, Klein threw away the animal hide lantern in his hand. Leaning against a thick stone pillar, he barely managed to imagine layers of spherical lights. He didn't care about the dangers of sleeping in such an environment. Let the danger come strike harder. Before he fell asleep, Klein shouted in his heart. The black-robed Amon glanced at him before casually sitting down beside him and snapping his fingers. The candle that was about to burn out in the lantern stopped melting, but the dim yellow light continued to spread. Despite only having fuel to last a few more minutes, it seemed to be able to last another few hours or even days. It was like an error that violated the laws of nature. After for an unknown period of time of feeling groggy, Klein finally recovered his energy and was woken up by Miss Magician's prayers. He was temporarily unable to respond to this. He closed his eyes and pretended that he was still dreaming. Without being parasitized at a deeper level, I don't think Amon can monitor my thoughts. He can only tell if my thoughts are harmful to him. With a thought, he secretly summoned the grayish-white fog. He had borrowed a state from his past self through the historical void, a state that wasn't directly meant for escaping. That was when Vin Rambus invaded his island of consciousness. This attempt wasn't stopped or stolen. Using this state, and the fact that he was able to maintain his lucidity in dreams and the mind world regardless of any intrusions, he split a portion of his self-awareness and stayed in the spiritual sky, calmly looking down at the island. He began to examine if there were any abnormalities in his mind and thoughts that were being parasitized. After a series of strict comparisons, he confirmed that there was nothing wrong with his mind world. In other words, even if there was still a worm of time in his body, it was still considered being parasitized at a superficial level. It was impossible to monitor his thoughts. After finding such a safe zone, Klein finally released his repressed thoughts and analyzed the current situation. He considered the subsequent methods for self-preservation. Amon is a god of mischief and also a god of deceit. It's impossible that he is playing this game purely for his entertainment. If he really wants to do that, he can definitely wait until he meets with his true body and steals my fate. He can attempt it after obtaining Sapphira Castle. That way, even if something unexpected happens, his main goal will also be achieved and he wouldn't suffer any losses. What is his goal behind this matter? If I can grasp the crux of the matter, I might be able to discover true freedom. Also, after he recited the luck enhancement ritual incantation in Mandarin, he actually didn't show any concern towards this special language, nor did he ask any questions. This totally doesn't match the sense of curiosity that he portrays. Did he deliberately use the word bug to probe me, so as to see what connections I'll make? But he didn't steal my thoughts. No, if all my ideas are disjointed from one another, I wouldn't be able to discover that they've been stolen. Klein recalled the situation back then, and he used the logical connections between his thoughts to confirm that he hadn't had his thoughts stolen. This made him confirm one thing, that was, that being parasitized at a deeper level, Amon could directly monitor his thoughts without stealing it. Amon made it seem that he had to notice malintent before he took action. It was a bluff. I knew it. This deeper level of parasitization seems to be different from what Palez described. Based on this deduction, the thoughts that I've been thinking of along the way have been heard by Amon, including Earth, fellow Earthling, and child education. How terrifying. Thankfully, when I was plotting to destroy the advancement ritual of George III, I had imagined the perilous situation of being parasitized by Amon. Half of my thoughts were my instinctive reactions, while the other half was intentionally let loose. This way, not only do I reveal my secrets, but I can also use this to gain Amon's trust, concealing the most important and core matters. For now, he definitely knows that I plan to obtain more historical secrets from him, so as to quickly digest the scholar of your potion. However, He doesn't know that I'm not far from being able to fully digest it. I'm just a few steps short or just one opportunity away. Did Amon deliberately remove the parasite and play such a game with me because he had once heard of Earth from the ancient sun god and had come into contact with some secrets? He plans on using my attempt to save myself to complete certain matters that might be inconvenient or impossible for him? If that's the case, there will definitely be something happening next. Yes, I have to show that I didn't notice this and still plan on escaping like a normal person. Once I've returned to my optimal state, I'll make my first attempt. After a while, Klein opened his eyes. The pointed hat-wearing Amon sat beside him and smiled at him. Have you decided? When are you going to take action? He acted as if he was Klein's partner and not the target from which Klein was trying to escape from. Chapter 1157. Poise. Klein pressed down on the grayish-white wall and slowly sat up straight. He smiled and shook his head. Before I fill my stomach, my brain refuses to work. He was speaking the truth, and also a lie. This was because, before becoming a complete mythical creature, a saint would still be hungry and thirsty. But to a Sequence 3 demigod, not eating or drinking for half a month wasn't a problem. As for a whole mythical creature, eating was only a hobby, not a necessity. What he wanted to express was that, before he officially made attempts at escaping, he needed to be in optimal condition. The habit of a magician, Amon commented with a smile. I'm not in charge of providing food, but you can think of a solution yourself. Looking at the lantern on the ground, Klein thought for a few seconds before reaching out his right hand into the air. A not-so-tall coffee table immediately appeared in front of him. It was an item from the residence belonging to Dwayne Dantes. Under the dim yellow light, Klein reached out once again to summon a beautifully packaged box from the historical void. Inside the box was a set of cutlery, including a knife, fork, and cup. The reason why he chose this item was because he couldn't form a set of cutlery by individually summoning them. He could only maintain 3 images from the historical void at the same time. After setting up the cutlery in a leisure manner, Klein politely turned his head to the side and nodded at the pointed hat-wearing Amon. Following that, he summoned a medium well-done steak covered in black pepper sauce. It landed on the porcelain plate, emitting some steam. With him slicing the steak with the knife, he revealed the remaining edge of the pink protein. Klein forked a piece of beef and stuffed it into his mouth. He felt that the texture was real and the texture was succulent. It wasn't fake at all, as it really calmed the anxiety of his stomach. For 15 minutes, not only will I not feel hungry, but I will also receive real provisions. After swallowing the piece of beef, Klein smiled and introduced it to Amon like a hospitable host, and not a pitiful beyonder who had been kidnapped. Amon pressed against the crystal monocle and nodded with a smile. I've tried it. It's not bad. Your ability to adapt is really quick. Are you really not considering being my blessed? After cutting another chunk of beef, Klein forked it up and replied as though he was chatting with a friend, "Kill me." At that moment, the relative frequent lightning and endless darkness ruled the land. Wherever the light from the surroundings couldn't shine on, eyes were staring at the area with zero emotion. The twisted, dark red grass gently swayed in the occasional breeze. In the half-collapsed building, the dim yellow light painted the artistic coffee table and the exquisite cutlery with warm colors. The aroma of the steak wafted in the air, not showing any contrast with the outside world that was continuously connected to it. Under the gaze of the terrifying monsters in the depths of the darkness, Klein enjoyed a sumptuous meal in a refined and poised manner in the desolate land that was soaked in extreme terror. After finishing his steak, he summoned a small glass of iced wine from Mager Manor and drank it in one gulp. Following that, cream soup, pan-fried cod, tender lamb stew with peas, baked potato skins, and all sorts of grape wines were summoned one after another before entering Klein's stomach. During this process, the steak that was the first to be eaten had already been maintained for a long period of time. It had vanished into thin air, but Klein's stomach and body were numbed by the subsequent food and he was oblivious to it. Of course, the coffee table and food were replenished. Otherwise, they wouldn't have lasted to the end of his meal. At the end of the meal, Klein continued reaching out his hand, pulling out a cup from the void. Inside was a ball of vanilla ice cream. He then used the spoon to scoop the ice cream into his mouth, feeling it melt with its delicious sweetness. After the ball was finished, he still wasn't satisfied as he summoned another ball of ice cream from the historical void. As such, he ate 5 different flavors of ice cream in a consecutive fashion. When Klein reached out his hand for the 6th time, Amon, who was sitting on his side, suddenly laughed. "Your fate has had an abnormal change. You're lucky enough. Is this your preparation?" Klein's right hand immediately froze in midair. His pupils seemed to dilate to a certain extent. Almost at the same time, in the darkness around them, where the lanterns couldn't shine, strange creatures twitched and instantly became Klein's marionette. This time, Klein sent out 100 worms of spirit in one go, hoping that one of them would be lucky enough to avoid Amon's theft. Right on the heels of that, behind the coffee table, a figure wearing a black coat and no hat was replaced with a disgusting vampire covered in pus. The artistic coffee table and exquisite cutlery shattered like glass that had been smashed to the ground. Countless cracks appeared and shattered. They quickly returned to the historical void, just in case it affected Klein's subsequent summoning attempts. In the next second, the 100 marionettes, along with the Klein, who had hidden somewhere, reached out to grab at the void. He attempted to avoid Amon's interference with quantity. At that moment, they were all scholars of yore. This was the ability of bizarro sorcerers, the source of the qualitative change of a seer. Of course, the chances of success of each marionette's summoning was independent, so there was no influence each had with the other. At that moment, the projection that Klein was summoning was the projection of Rionette Tinker, who had recovered to her peak state in the Tudor ruins. Due to the contract and charms, she was the easiest angel projection he could summon from the historical void. Amon was still sitting leisurely in his spot. His monocle emitted a faint glow as he watched the 101 Klein summon at the same time. With his right hands reaching out in an orderly manner before being retracted, none of his 100 marionettes succeeded. He didn't drag Rionette Tinker out of the void. At that moment, Amon raised his right hand and also grabbed ahead of him. His arm sank slightly, and he casually pulled it back. Outside the half-collapsed building, a huge cloth doll that was as huge as a castle appeared. It was wearing a dark and complicated long dress, bound by vines. Ancient Bane Rionette Tinker. Amon had stolen the historical image that was summoned by Klein. Rionette Tinker's red eyes immediately reflected the figures of Klein's 100 marionettes. Without a sound, the marionettes, that were either disguised with Klein's appearance or in the state of a monster, emitted a faint glow, turning into homed mountain goats, white rabbits, and other different animals. Transformation curse. Klein's actual body had long disappeared. Then, he walked out of the flames that rose up from the animal hide lantern. He looked at the various animals that might be considered his and suddenly sat down and chuckled. Taking a stroll after a meal effectively improves one's health. He didn't mention anything about his attempt to escape, as if nothing had happened. Amon maintained his relaxed posture and nodded cooperatively. "I've read quite a number of books written by humans. There are indeed such opinions among them." With that said, he raised his hand and pointed at the projection of Rionette Tinker. "This is your messenger?" This was something that could be easily confirmed, so Klein didn't hide it. He tersely acknowledged and nodded. What a pity. Amon sized up Rionette Tinker's projection and shook his head with a TSK. As he felt the food in his stomach disappear, Klein asked, "What's the matter?" "I should bring you to Backlund to wait for a few more days. That way, I can wait for your messenger to deliver a letter to you. Then, she will become my messenger." Amon nudged his monocle on his right eye and said with a smile, "Snatching an angel messenger. That will be very challenging and fun, isn't it?" "Life needs some fun, excitement, and anticipation." "I share the same thoughts," Klein replied sincerely. "What a pity." The hatted Amon shook his head again. Eve might is someone I need to be careful about. If we stayed there any longer, even I wouldn't have any idea what would happen. As he spoke, this angel of time dispelled the historical void projection of Rionette Tinker, allowing her to vanish in front of Klein. You seem to be very wary of the goddess? Klein pretended to be a devout believer of the Evernight goddess. Of course, he didn't need to don a disguise. He was still a blessed of Evernight. Amon's gaze shifted to the lantern inside the half-collapsed building and looked at the dim yellow light. I'm unable to steal things that I'm curious about from a concealed state. I can't decipher what other arrangements she might have and what the key thing to take note of are. To a king of angels of the Marauder pathway, there was sufficient reason to be apprehensive. Taking advantage of the opportunity while Amon was answering his question, Klein suddenly recited the honorific name of the Evernight goddess in Jotun. You are the Eve-Might goddess who stands higher than the cosmos and more eternal than eternity. Just as he said that, his thoughts were lost. If he hadn't had such plans previously, he wouldn't have known that he had made such an attempt. Amon turned to look at him and said with a smile, Are you trying to sound me out, believing that I'll also repeat your words after stealing your thoughts and words? At Sequence 4 Parasite, one is able to control the stolen items and make them appear at a suitable time. Is that so? Klein nodded gently. Thank you. As he spoke, Klein quickly summarized his experience and lessons of his escape attempt. Because the existence of the contract and their subordinated relationship, summoning Miss Messenger is the easiest amongst all the angels I know. Summoning the ice cream from the past can establish a subtle connection with he who represents fate, and allow me to be blessed with luck. Yes, every ball of ice cream represents a portion of my luck. I originally planned on summoning ice cream as a cover to secretly summon the Snake of Fate. In the future, the summoning had to be done with a certain degree of interference. Otherwise, Amon would be able to directly steal the historical void image I summon. It would only be giving him a helper after going through so much effort. Just as his thoughts raced, Amon pointed at the bunch of animals that had been cursed by the transformation curse, and he said with a slightly evil smile, Aren't you worried that there won't be any suitable food in the forsaken land of the gods? There it is, as long as we don't dispel the curse, they're real animals. Klein was stunned as he suddenly looked at the goats and the white rabbits. With him willing them, the animals looked at him simultaneously. In a sense, they were all himself. After all, they were combinations of worms of spirit and monsters before being hit by the curse. Chapter 1158. Coming to terms. After silently staring at the rabbits and mountain goats for more than 10 seconds, Klein closed his eyes and flicked his right index finger and middle finger as if he was pressing an invisible piano key. A third of the marionette collapsed, losing the feeling of being alive. Klein's expression immediately warped, as though he had been struck 33 times by a giant sword. The familiar and extreme pain he felt swept through his spirit body, causing light-colored meat tendrils to sprout on his body. Every sprout seemed to be forming a transparent maggot. This was the backlash from killing 33 worms of spirit. After taking nearly 15 minutes to recover, Klein made his second attempt at letting the other third of his marionettes die. The same pain, the same time to rest, and the same actions were repeated again. Finally, he completely finished off this batch of cursed marionettes. He couldn't handle it all at once because the damage caused by the death of 100 worms of spirit was enough to make him lose control. And being cursed meant that he couldn't directly solve the problem by retrieving the characteristics. Of course, this was the standard of a scholar of yore who had just advanced recently. It wasn't the performance of a scholar of yore who was almost done digesting the potion. In fact, the loss of 100 worms of spirit would only worsen the pain, without him showing any signs of losing control or affecting the battle. He was only acting just now, allowing his performance to match his role. At his level, losing half the number of worms of spirit that he had at the same time would lead to losing control. Once he completely digested the scholar of your potion, he would be able to recover from having nearly 500 worms of spirit die at once. Even if he lost all the corresponding Beyonder characteristics, he wouldn't lose his status and level. He could slowly recover his strength by absorbing the Beyonder characteristics of the seer pathway. After completing this, the recovered Klein walked out of the half-collapsed tower-like building. He went to the darkness outside and brought back a few white rabbits and a goat. He then realized that the darkness in the forsaken land of the gods wasn't as dangerous as Little Sun had described. Most of the monsters were weak. No, to be precise, the danger lurking in the depths of the darkness, apart from making people evaporate into thin air, nothing else can compare to the fellow beside me named Amon. Klein glanced at the thin man who was sitting near the lantern, smiling as he watched him busy himself. He summoned something like boiled water from the historical void, and he squatted down, seriously removing the fur and flesh from the white rabbits and goat. After a series of tasks, Klein set up a bonfire. He set up a barbecue rack that came from history, and he placed a white rabbit on it. He brushed it with a full set of condiments he made himself, like basil, fennel, and salt, as he constantly turned the meat over. At this moment, the delicacies from the historical void he had eaten before had long disappeared due to him no longer maintaining their existence. His body and soul were calling out for replenishment. A tempting fragrance was gradually emanated as Amon's nose twitched slightly. "You're really eating them?" Without waiting for his reply, the god of mischief continued, "They're essentially the flesh of monsters and your worms of spirit. Are you sure you want to eat them? There's no way to undo the curse at the level of an angel. If there's no way to resist or correct it at the same level, there's no way of dispelling it. Since a thing looks like a rabbit, smells like a rabbit, and tastes like a rabbit, it's a rabbit." As Klein seriously roasted the rabbit, he gave a self-deprecating laugh. "Besides, how can I not maintain the best state if I want to escape from your grasp? For this sliver of hope, I can only challenge my psychological limits. This is what it means to endure humiliation and suffering," Klein added inwardly. At the same time, he sighed at the ancient Bane's transformation curse. This was many times stronger than a sequence 3 disciple of Silence's curse. There's almost no limit to the amount of time it can be maintained. Clearly, an ordinary animal can use all of my beyonder powers through the worm of spirit, but a deformed marionette due to a curse isn't possible. This is a curse at the angel level. Apart from putting up resistance from someone at the same level, one can use the correct method to remove it. No curse is irreversible. There are always loopholes. Heh, will kissing this rabbit turn it into Gehrman Sparrow? Klein made a self-deprecating comment as he analyzed to compose himself. After hearing his reply, the monocled Amon nodded with a smile. "Very good. This is indeed a good revelation to have." Klein didn't respond as he resumed his barbecue. Not long after, with the help of flame controlling, he finished roasting a rabbit and a goat's leg. Taking advantage of the opportunity before the condiments disappeared, he matched some sweet iced tea he summoned from the historical void with the food, filling his mouth with fragrance. It nourished his body and mind, allowing him to effectively relieve the pressure, despair, and indecisiveness from being kidnapped by Amon. During this process, he would occasionally recall the disgusting looks of the monsters, as well as the fact that the worms of spirit were equivalent to himself. However, he was able to bring his feelings under control very well. After filling his stomach and replenishing his energy, he turned the remaining ingredients next to the fire into dry rations, as though he was saving up for his subsequent plans. Seeing him slowly but orderly making all sorts of preparations, Amon suddenly nudged his monocle and asked with a slight smile, "In actuality, you're trying to stall for time before we reach the actual destination, right?" Klein's hands paused for a moment before he continued with his actions. He smiled and said, "Yes, I'm waiting for help." "Guess who?" Amon didn't answer directly as he said with a smile, "I'm looking forward to it." Klein continued his work until he prepared rations for 3 or 4 meals. He thought for a moment and once again reached his hand into the void in front of Amon. He failed again and again as he kept making attempts. It was unknown what item he was trying to summon, but it seemed like he was using his actions to dare Amon into stealing it. After watching for a few seconds, Amon smiled and shook his head. He slowly stood up and walked out the half-collapsed tower building. Klein's right hand stopped in mid-air before he retracted it and pinched his forehead. He muttered to himself in puzzlement, what was I trying to do just now? While trying to recall, Klein stood up as well. He brought along his packed rations, picked up the animal hide lantern, and walked to the back of Amon's side. The man and Angel circled around the hill and entered a valley. The water was sloshing in the river, but when the dim yellow light shone at it, or when the lightning in the sky lit up the area, Klein realized that there was no water in the riverbed. The sounds he had heard earlier had also disappeared. A river that has been transferred into a concealed state. After some deliberation, he raised a question to Amon. That's right. It will only appear in darkness void of light, Amon replied with a slight nod, unfazed with the question. Can I drink it? Klein pressed. Amon smiled and said, sure. This was once one of the water sources of a city that had persisted for 1,600 years in the darkness. As long as you can bring the water away from the riverbed, they can appear in places with light. Your next move is to suggest that I bring the lantern to wait by the side while you hydrate yourself in the darkness? And then, take this opportunity to transform into a concealed state? Klein smiled awkwardly. How could I use such a simple method? Hearing that, Amon laughed and stroked his monocle. Sometimes, the simplest plan is the most effective. You can give it a try. With regards to the words of this peerless swindler, Klein couldn't believe it, nor did he dare to believe it. He was afraid that the other party was using reverse psychology with the truth. He could only put the matter of the water aside and ask, in the forsaken land of the gods, how many human gathering points, like the city of silver, have yet to be destroyed? Amon looked ahead and said without changing his expression, the ones I know don't exceed 10. In this aspect, the city of silver is lucky. At least, they can see and have the ability to touch the light. This means that the city of silver is very close to the giant king's court, the door leading out of the forsaken land of the gods. There's no need to risk death to reach it. As for the other cities, no matter how steadfast they are in the darkness, no matter how many exploration teams they send out, it will all be futile. There's no way to find the exit. Indeed, from this angle, the city of silver is unfortunate, and also lucky. This is purely dependent on the reference point. Klein held the lantern as he proceeded along the bank and began coming up with his second attempt at escaping. Amon walked beside him, occasionally providing him with ideas that seemed reliable but had unknown actual results. He appeared to be suffering from schizophrenia, trying his best to destroy his true body's hopes in obtaining Sapphira Castle. On the other side of the giant king's court, in the city of silver. After receiving the chief's summoning call, Derek Berg brought the unshadowed crucifix to the top of the spire and entered a spacious room. There was a mysterious and complicated altar set up here. Different items were placed in different spots, a total of 6 items, each of them emanating a dangerous aura. With a glance, Derek saw an ordinary silver flute, a mask made from a skull, and the remains of a deformed person. You have the unshadowed crucifix. You can stay here for 15 minutes, but you can't exceed that time. Otherwise, you will suffer a sudden death. Colin Iliad wore a linen shirt and a brown coat as he exhorted Derek. Derek's spiritual perception was triggered as he asked, Your Excellency, is this because of that twilight mask? His right hand pointed at the mask made from a skull. Yes. Colin nodded slightly and said, I've already prepared the remains of 6 powerful creatures. These were all hunted by myself, or with me as the main force. Derek was immediately enlightened. You still lack the blessings of a deity? Colin instantly fell silent. After nearly 10 seconds, he opened his mouth and slowly said, yes. After some hesitation and struggles, he finally chose the fool. At least those mushrooms had given the city of silver hope. Derek suppressed his joy and thought back to the interactions at the Tarot Club. He raised a question in puzzlement. Why didn't you let those 2 god-level sealed artifacts give you their blessings? He remembered that subsidiary gods, or angels, could satisfy the requirements of the ritual. It wasn't the case that only a sequence 0 true deity could provide blessings. After all, a silver knight was only a sequence 3. Colin fell silent again and hesitated for a few seconds before saying, "They won't give blessings." Chapter 1159 Validation. They won't give blessings. Derek was a little confused by this answer, not fully comprehending it. Back in the afternoon town camp, when he handed the Silver Knight potion formula to Chief Colin Iliad, the other party had praised him for making a huge contribution. He believed that the upper limit of the City of Silver was no longer that of Sequence 4, and his tone didn't reveal the need to seek blessings from external sources. Hence, Derek had always believed that the chief would be able to use the 2 god-level sealed artifacts to complete the Silver Knight's advancement ritual. Now, it was inevitable that he was surprised. Back then, the chief didn't know that the 2 god-level sealed artifacts couldn't provide blessings, and he only realized this problem when he returned to the City of Silver. Derek subconsciously made a guess and didn't ask further. He nodded heavily and said, "All right, I will try my best to help you seek blessings from a deity." Demon Hunter Colin exhaled silently and pointed at the door. "There's no one in the room opposite." Derek turned around and passed through the corridor, entering the half-open room. Then, he took a seat and recited softly, "The fool that doesn't belong to this era. The mysterious ruler above the gray fog. The king of yellow and black who wields good luck, inside Sapphira Castle, and hidden within the gray fog, the crimson star representing the sun rapidly expanded and contracted." It kept repeating the process, producing rings of please. And not far beside it, the crimson star representing the magician remained in the same state because of the fool's lack of a response. The circular rings, ripples, and tremors that the two created intertwined and became more intense. Under the illumination of the bolts of lightning, Klein carried a leather lantern and walked into the valley. He suddenly felt that the illusory pleas in his ears became even more chaotic and louder. However, he realized that he had heard it clearer than before. Not only could he tell that the plea came from a woman and a man, but he could also vaguely make out certain content. The woman seemed to mention the world and Backland. The man used Jotun, and the keyword seemed to be a ritual. Ritual, Jotun. That's little son. That chief wishes to receive Mr. Fool's blessings? Mr. Fool also needs some blessings right now. The woman might be Miss Magician, but I can't rule out Miss Justice either. The corners of Klein's mouth twitched in embarrassment. He turned his head to look at Amon in the pointed hat and monocle, and he said, "Can I pop over to Sapphira Castle to answer a prayer? What do you think?" Amon was taken aback as he asked in amusement. "Since you want to play such a game, why won't you let it be more exciting?" In fact, Klein didn't have any hope regarding his request. This was because, as long as he could return to Sapphira Castle, he could use the power there to make the first step in escaping from his predicament. This was equivalent to getting Amon to just set him free. The reason he mentioned this was because he wanted to use this to start the subsequent topic. Amon nudged the crystal monocle with his knuckle and chuckled. "As the god of mischief, I've been alive since the third epoch. I believe you know what that means." "Yes, what do you want to ask? This is an accurate grasp of my state of mind and thoughts." Klein sighed and asked, "Why did you parasitize the City of Silver's exploration team back then? You even patiently stayed in the dungeon for decades." Amon nodded and replied in a relaxed manner, "I had a premonition that the City of Silver would obtain extremely important information. Now, this prophecy has come true, right, Mr. Fool? He did all of that just to wait for me in the Tarot Club?" From the looks of it, this Marauder Pathway's King of Angels can see the disturbances in fate caused by Sapphira Castle to a certain extent. Klein had never expected the answer, leaving him momentarily at a loss as to how to continue the topic. After about 10 seconds, he sighed and said, "You're really patient." He was a king of angels who liked to play pranks, yet, he actually stayed inside a dark dungeon without any sources of entertainment for decades. This has nothing to do with patience. "It didn't take too much of my time," Amon casually replied. "I'm still used to using a human standards when talking about a deity." To Amon, who was born as a complete mythical creature, a few decades is nothing. He might even be more than 3,000 years old. Klein regulated what he knew and asked again, "The the City of Silver is one of the few places that persist on believing in your father. Aren't you going overboard with what you did to the expedition team? This question didn't seem to be necessary, but Klein believed that it would aid him in understanding Amon's thoughts and style, doing so in order to see if there was anything that could be used. Amon turned his head and glanced at him with his monocled right eye. He said with an indifferent smile, "If it wasn't for their faith in my father, the City of Silver would have already been reduced to ruins. According to my observations, they're hiding quite a significant secret. As for what it is, because of the gaze directed by you and the hanged man, I haven't had the chance to pry into it, a true-born mythical creature. The deaths of just a few humans might be equivalent to trampling a few ants to death. He wouldn't take it to heart at all. The City of Silver actually has a secret that even Amon thinks is a big secret. What could it be?" Klein thoughtfully changed the topic. "Was Dark Angel Sasra really created from your father's rib?" This was something that Klein had wanted to ask the entire time, but he hadn't found the opportunity to ask. The smile on Amon's face faded as he looked at the darkness in front of him. Yes, he separated a portion of his characteristics and corresponding negative personalities. He used his rib as the material to create Dark Angel Sasra. If that wasn't the case, how could a proud and arrogant person like Medici obey the so-called left hand of God, the deputy of heaven? Without Sasra's rebellion, implication, and influence, even if Evernight, Earth, god of combat, and the other kings of angels joined forces, it's impossible for my father to perish. Indeed. Dark Angel Sasra is the most key factor in this matter. It's no wonder the goddess wanted to bewitch him at the very beginning. Who would have thought that he would betray himself? Klein's initial speculation of the battle of gods had been confirmed. He felt his scholar of your potion digest a little more. He deliberately hesitated and made a guess. Could your father have foreseen such a development? Dark Angel Sasra is also the key to his resurrection? Amon suddenly laughed. You asked so many questions in order to further digest the scholar of your potion, right? Klein pretended to break out in cold sweat, and he quickly adjusted his state of mind. I'm just curious. What are you looking for in the forsaken land of the gods? What are you pursuing? The Marauder Pathway Sequence 1 Beyonder characteristic that you're missing isn't here, nor is Sapphira Castle. Are you trying to revive your father? Amon maintained his smile and looked straight ahead. Yes, and no. My zealous brother is already very close to reviving my father. He probably doesn't need my help anymore. Adam really wants to revive the ancient sun god? I thought that he was purely doing it for the sake of becoming a Sequence 0. Without hiding anything, Klein called out the name of the Twilight Hermit Order's leader. He was even looking forward to Adam beating his younger brother up. Of course, beating someone up wasn't in line with the style of a king of angels of the spectator pathway. There's no need to mention his name. He won't interfere with my matters, nor will I interfere with his. I don't address him as Adam, because I think that a nickname like Zealous is very suitable for him. I have to say that Medici is very talented in giving nicknames. Also, even if I say his name, he wouldn't be able to hear it if I don't wish for him to hear it. At this moment, the monocled Amon smiled as he exposed Klein's idea. Following that, Klein didn't mention the Dark Angel any further, because it was obvious that Amon wouldn't answer. Before long, the man and angel walked out of the valley and saw a silent city. More than half of the buildings in this city had collapsed. The remaining ones had a sharp roof, as though they were towers that led to heaven. On the surface, dark red vines and plants grew, forming fruits whose edibility was unknown. After entering the city, he discovered that there were stone coffins placed in front of each house. Inside were skeletons or recently rotted corpses. A common point between them was them being greatly deformed. Some had 4 legs, some had a slit in the middle of their eyebrows, some lacked skin, directly revealing their flesh, some had arms wrapped around their necks like tails. This was originally a city that believed in the phoenix. Later, it converted its target of faith to my father, but it retained some customs related to death. The monocled Amon casually sized up his surroundings and said, after the cataclysm, they were left behind in the forsaken land of the gods. However, there were no edible, relatively normal plants around them, so they could only eat those corrupted monsters. Over generations, their bodies began to produce defects and psychological problems. Eventually, they were completely wiped out. The cataclysm brought about by the goddess's assassination of the City of Silver's creator really was a calamity for civilization. Before that, there were elven, giant, phoenix civilizations, and so on. After that, all that's left are traces of them. When Klein thought of the city that had been swallowed into the ground, he sighed. In the history books, in mysticism, it was very apt to call that history the cataclysm. He paused for a moment before asking, why are we entering this city instead of going around it? Amon smiled and said, in the second epoch, apart from wielding the death pathway, the Phoenix ancestor also occupied part of the apprentice pathway. Some of the decorations here can become a loophole that I can make use of to shorten our journey to our final destination. Klein's expression immediately darkened. You're tuning into the Biyao's Wuxia Chronicles YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.